Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 93 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Today, we're going to be discussing, did Google or did China ban Bitcoin? And spoiler alert, they did some flip-flops, but we're going to be discussing that. And we're going to be discussing everything that happened this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. In fact, we got 2 weeks to catch up on. I had a couple of family issues to attend to, but let's dive right in. If you're new to the show, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 25 years of my life studying Bitcoin, investing, and money. 14 years in Bitcoin, right from the very first Bitcoin conference, and wrote the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. After leaving a career at the banksters in investment banking, and being involved in investing in many of the largest companies in our industry. And we are on a mission to prepare you for a world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. And so within the context of did Google and China ban Bitcoin, from the Bitcoin side, we're going to be covering a few stories. Obviously, we'll go into what happened with Google this week and why they flip-flop, what happened with China over the last 2 weeks and why they flip-flop, and also, why did America state that they're no longer having a Bitcoin strategic reserve, only to flip-flop themselves? We'll go through how to interpret it, how to protect yourself, and how to move forward so that you don't care what China does, what America does, or what Google do. And in the second section, part 2, we're going to be going through this week in macro. We're going to be going through why the US debt on every angle is at record highs, and why the previous time that this happened was right before the global financial crisis, as well as the Great Depression of the 1930s. What that means and how to prepare yourself, why we are now in rising inflation, despite the fact that they'll be telling you we're not, and what is the latest in the China trade war? Is it working? Is it not working? We'll look at the stats, the real numbers, and we'll get through all of the propaganda that they don't want you to know so that you can be prepared. In part 3, this week in geopolitics, we're going to be going through the latest on following the money, ignoring the headlines, and understanding how to really interpret the headlines and what these Egypt deals mean, and how the world is turning Israel into a toxic asset using oil trade deals and Jeffrey Epstein. So we're going to be going through all of that today. And so let's jump in with the very first section, part 1, this week in Bitcoin. Right, a bunch of stories. So we've been talking over the months about these Bitcoin treasury companies. It started with Strategy. It used to be called MicroStrategy. They've now got over 600,000 Bitcoin, and they've now got even perpetual preference debt collateralized obligations in order to be able to raise on tap to buy more Bitcoin. Now, when you take all of the different treasury companies, and there's over 100 of them right now, and all of the different ETFs, the largest one being BlackRock, they've grown their holdings of Bitcoin across all of the public companies and all of the ETFs to approximately 3.64 million Bitcoin. So that's approximately 17% of the total supply that is being held within the confines of a corporate structure. We must fight back with Bitcoin in self-custody because we don't fall for these shenanigans. That is 3 million Bitcoin that is subject to somebody else's whims, board control, the decisions of government, whether they want to cease it, confiscate it, cease trading, open trading. You don't need to be subjected to any of those things. And yet you decide that you're going to give your Bitcoin to BlackRock and give your Bitcoin to Strategy and buy a share instead. And from the high net asset value of Strategy to where it is today, Bitcoin has been outperforming these treasury companies. So then you ask, what is it that I'm investing in? Keep it simple, stupid kiss. You own Bitcoin in self-custody, and hang around till the end. I'm going to be giving you resources with a step-by-step guide of how to self-custody, because I keep hearing it wherever I go. Whenever I'm on X Spaces, people are saying, Simon, I'm down. I want to own my own Bitcoin. I want to be able to spend my own money. I want to be able to store my own money. And I want to outperform the Federal Reserve in every asset class because historically Bitcoin has done that because of its fixed supply. But how do I do it? Have no fear. I've got a guide for you, and I've got the best in the world to make you understand from all the mistakes that I've made over the last 14 years, how to secure those Bitcoin and self-custody securely. So hang around to the end and I'll tell you exactly, completely free, how to get those resources. But just this, corporations have essentially bought $43 billion of Bitcoin this year alone in 2025, $43 billion worth of Bitcoin in these treasury companies. That's a 3.75x more than the miners are actually mining. So miners that mine Bitcoin for providing the security, they get 3.125 Bitcoin every 10 minutes across all the different miners that are competing. Now that we have over 1,000 exahashes of security, and we have the largest distributed supercomputer that no government, no central bank, no actor can infiltrate, is even beyond the grubby mitts of BlackRock. We'll obviously keep looking out for these things and what they're up to, and I'll keep covering it every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk so that we can get ahead of it. But the whole point of Bitcoin is that people try to attack it, Bitcoin reacts, and we carry on mining one block every 10 minutes and rewarding those miners with their newly created Bitcoin. But there is way more demand from these companies relative to what's actually being mined, which is why we've hit this steady upflow market with a little bit of volatility in between, but nothing like what we used to have. In fact, a publicly traded gold company, one of the gold miners, they're now mining gold, selling it on the market for dollars, and then holding Bitcoin in treasury on their balance sheet. Because obviously gold has all the problems of auditability, transportability. The physical location is both a feature and a bug. You know, if the internet goes down and the world goes into chaos, then you want some gold on you. But while the internet is still working, and in fact, if you're running your own nodes connected to a satellite and you have the correct self-custody set up that I'll teach you about for those that want to do this, you'll work anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but most people are. But the gold miner, rather, ECR Minerals, is basically planning to add Bitcoin to its reserves, which is a really interesting angle. Mine gold, convert it to dollars, store Bitcoin, and it works completely scalable as a global corporation. Now, we've got more and more financial institutions. We're very skeptical of the banksters on the proof of weapons network that are now realizing that maybe if I just store in peaceful proof of work, I don't need to leverage up a debt-based Ponzi scheme and force governments, individuals, and corporations into debt because I don't have a systemic nature of fiat currency, which is created as a debt. And wherever there's a debt, there is an interest. And the money to repay the interest doesn't exist. So you can only repay the debt with more debt, which is why these banksters are debt dealers. And that's why we have many wars, because they need to extract resources in order to roll over the debt in a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And they're deciding actually the returns in peaceful proof of work versus fiat proof of weapons is actually turning out to be a lot easier. And as the world is getting disgraced with all these wars, genocide, and all of these holocausts that are happening right now, maybe it might be easier just for me to pivot into peaceful proof of work and just stack some sats. And so the financial terrorist SBI Holding, one of the largest major Japanese banks and financial institutions, they've been involved in Bitcoin for a while, actually. I remember when I used to go to Japan, the Japanese Bitcoin community were very early on. Some of the earliest exchanges were in Japan. But they're looking to introduce two new Bitcoin ETFs into the Japanese market. Now, if you remember, those that had pensions that wanted exposure to Bitcoin, they couldn't get it within their pension. So they were buying companies like Metaplanet that was buying Bitcoin, arbitraging the fact that you couldn't really get Bitcoin in your pension. And this was trading at many, many crazy multiples above the price of the Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Now, the banks have come along and said, hey, why don't we just create a Bitcoin ETF and allow Japanese investors to buy Bitcoin via our ETF? Because SBI Holdings wants you to hold your Bitcoin with them so that they can hold it in custody, so that in the future, they can offer you financial products so they can try and turn your hard money into charging fees and using it as collateral against loans. And so they can try and make sure that they maximize the profit on their financial weapons of mass destruction rather than you just holding it in self-custody. But you still want that Metaplanet stock? Methinks that when the Japanese Bitcoin ETF comes out, that it may not be as useful. And so these are inherently regulatory arbitrage, short-term thinking. And I want everyone to have long-term plans so that they don't have to sit there in front of a stock market, looking at prices, wondering about the quarterly earnings, seeing what the Federal Reserve is going to do. I'm a geek. I'll do all that for you. I'll give you Bitcoin Hard Talk each week. And all you need to do is commit to owning more Bitcoin each month and learn how to put it in self-custody. And don't worry, I've got your back. I'm going to make sure you got the resources that you need. I've been listening to your comments. Make sure you add those comments. I do read them. And based upon your feedback, I'm going to make sure you got what you need. So stick to Bitcoin in self-custody. And you don't need to care about any of these things. However, if you're a geek like me, you'll find it interesting so you can see what the world is doing, and maybe you can prepare more people to not make some of those mistakes. But BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF is now the second largest ETF in terms of monthly flows. Every single month, more money flows into the Bitcoin ETF than any other ETF in the world other than the S&P or the main market. Isn't that absolutely remarkable? We're way larger than the inflows into the gold ETF. And yet the market cap of, the money supply dollars is like 22 trillion, which is the same as gold, 22 trillion. And Bitcoin's only 2.5 trillion. We're now the fifth largest asset in the world. In fact, we're going to go into why Google made us messing around, because we're competing with you, Google. It's either the fifth or the sixth. But that's a temporary thing. We're going to eat your dust and we're going to catch up with gold. Why? Because the world needs Bitcoin. In fact, Ethiopia is actually now utilizing as a state and has just made $55 million worth of Bitcoin. They're now mining, and they're mining it with surplus hydropower. So they're using resource energy and hydropower in order to take the wasted hydropower, plug it up and connect it to a Bitcoin miner. And now they're getting $55 million worth of Bitcoin that previously would have just been wasted energy, wasted electricity. Think what $55 million can make a difference in Ethiopia, a victim of the proof of weapons network, that all of their resources have been raped, pillaged, stole, colonialized. And now they can build their own Bitcoin stack, and maybe they can start to stand up to the proof of weapons network. Maybe now they can say, you want our resources? If you want our resources, you have to come and build your factories and hire our people on our ground, and we'll give you the finished product. Why? Because we got Bitcoin power and we got some negotiating leverage, and we don't need your dirty fiat currency, IMF economic hitmen. We can fight back by using hydropower, and we can do that with wasted energy that didn't even have a utility before. They're turning wasted energy into hard money. They're building their defense against the proof of weapons network. This is now a national security, peaceful proof of work to defend against the colonial proof of network empires in a time when the global south are the only ones still having children. And so all the demographics are driving the proof of weapons network to want to work with the global south as they actually turn inwards and create war, like in Russia and Ukraine. and try and profit from war in the West because they're turning south and working east. In fact, speaking of such, Indonesia, their vice president's office is now weighing up the adoption of having Bitcoin as a national reserve asset. And so we've got that. And you know what's really interesting? Indonesia, a predominantly majority Muslim nation country, they don't have, Bitcoin doesn't have any riba, which is interest. And so you can't even be Islamic finance compliant if you're dealing with fiat currencies. They've tried to work around that. But when you're building on top of a fiat currency system that is created as a debt, that in its creation as a debt has riba or interest built in, you've just built a product on top of, a halal product on top of a haram product. Now, but thanks to Bitcoin, if they start using it as a national reserve asset, they can start exploring how to actually have finance the way they were meant to have it, by doing it with hard money. And so, there's no riba baked into the creation of Bitcoin. It's only baked into the creation of these debt-based Ponzi schemes. And that's because when they installed these proof of weapons central banks in order to destroy you and control you, this is the way to do it as well. So it's not just gold now. It's also got the digital version that can scale and work on a big scale. Speaking of the global south, we've been covering El Salvador for a long time. Went to visit the president there on many occasions to see how I can help. But El Salvador just announced that they're going to be launching a Bitcoin bank. I actually gave and shared the vision of how to do that when I went to meet President Bukele in El Salvador. Not a big fan of what's happening with these prisons at the moment and the partnership with Trump. So at the moment, I'm trying to see what's going on there. And also the IMF are giving mixed signals as they try and remove the Bitcoin strategy. But at the moment, we'll keep covering it because El Salvador is fighting back with a Bitcoin bank. And obviously, Bukele has said, hey, that constitution where, we only get 5 years. Yeah, maybe we'll extend that to 6 years and I'll give myself a third term. Look, I know what it takes in order to actually build something and how long it takes. And we also know that this quote unquote democracies whereby every 4 years you have to change your leadership so that the proof of weapons network can always be in control and you can turn over presidents and never change the system. Sometimes it requires desperate measures to change the system. We'll always be watching that as well. Bitcoin is perfect for the global south, and the world is moving towards the global south being the growth countries as well. Stable coins at the moment, we all know, I've covered this on many, many shows, how stable coins are the new central bank digital currency, but private control. But at the same time, they help people send money globally. There's a pro and a con to all of them. The way to combat that is only use it for spending, save in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin every month, the simple rules. But this is how big stable coins are getting right now, even though they're only just getting started. I mean, it's mainly concentrated in two companies I invested in, a company called Bitfinex that went on to launch Tether and a company called Circle that went on to launch USDC, and then others that are joining the race, including Trump's family's World Liberty Financial that we've covered. But stable coins on any given day are now doing more transaction volume than Visa. So all of the stable coins, all of the transaction volume without even having retail adoption. Now wait till everybody transitions to realizing that in the global south, you don't need to go to Visa or MasterCard and get a point of sale terminal. You don't need their permission to go through 8 different banks that will charge fee after fee after fee in order to transact. All you need is a QR code. And once you got a QR code and the whole world starts using QR codes, which everybody can have just by downloading a free app in order to accept that, and they can do it in self-custody. Now, obviously, stable coins are still centralized institutions. It's not Bitcoin. But then it's a step away from saying, hey, you know what? I'd like to receive my stable coin and I'd like 20% of it to auto convert to Bitcoin and hold that in self custody while I cover my operational overhead with the 80%. This is where we're moving, and wait till you have artificial intelligence agents that are going to programmatically engage in all your Salesforce activities. This is the world we're moving to, and this is really one way. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle. We are moving to a world of artificial intelligence, stablecoins, CBDCs, and Bitcoin is your resistance to protect yourself while you're also utilizing the fact that there's no changing the direction we are going right now. And speaking of which, on YouTube, we rely upon you. In fact, we just hit over 100,000 subscribers, 101, 250, I think we're at right now. So I want to thank you all. The YouTube did a little bit of a review. I'm not sure how much they like my content because it's still not. I've got comment after comment of people saying, I subscribed, but I'm not receiving any emails. They used to get these emails. And funnily enough, I tested this out. I went on my friend George Gammon's channel the other day. He had 16,000 subscribers. The same video got 100,000 views in a couple of days. I put it on my channel. I've got over 100,000 subscribers, and we got 10K views in the same time. And that's because YouTube doesn't like you to know what we're covering. In fact, Google flip-flopped. We're going to be covering that as one of our stories. But as a hedge, I've started to put this content, and you may be watching this from Rumble. Now, Rumble is subject to the same things. However, the investor in Rumble, one of the major investors, is Tether, the stablecoin. But the $3 billion YouTube competitor Rumble has now said it's going to integrate Bitcoin Lightning Network for tips. And so we shall see what this is like, but we may need to pivot away from YouTube. If YouTube doesn't send us some love, please help the algorithms by sharing, putting a comment, liking, and hopefully YouTube has some time to redeem itself. But if Rumble is giving us some love and Rumble is doing Lightning transactions, I don't need any tips, but hey, let's support the Lightning Network and we can figure out whether we can take those tips and do something good with it. But let's see what happens there. Just in case you're not following me on Rumble, look me up on Rumble, Simon Dixon. Got a very small following for now, so please help me build it up right now because you never know. I've been on YouTube right from the beginning, but we may need to transition over if the censorship continues. Right, now speaking of some of the different companies while we go through, Coinbase, a couple of weeks, this was meant to be covered last week, but they announced that they're going to be doing a $2 billion convertible note offering. Now, most people are thinking when these Bitcoin companies are doing note offerings, they're doing it in order to buy Bitcoin like the Treasury companies. But no, Coinbase is going to be doing it not to buy Bitcoin, but to invest in technology, acquisitions, and anti-dilution clauses, and all of the usual TradFi things. Now, what's interesting is the market is now saying, we prefer you to raise finance to buy Bitcoin than operating your business because Bitcoin's eating the world and they don't understand what they're going to be doing with the money. So the market hated it. As soon as Coinbase announced that it's going to be doing this and it's not buying Bitcoin, the stock price went down and the market didn't like it. On the very same day, the exact opposite happened with Robinhood because Robinhood is just adding new features and saying we're going to be tokenized securities. We're going to do 24/7. We're going to be doing more and more and more. And we're going to be putting Bitcoin on our balance sheet as well. And so the market is now demanding for these companies to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet as we're seeing more and more of these arbitrages in the equity capital markets as Bitcoin eats the fiat currency world based upon the money printing and the violence of the proof of weapon network. What else did we have? Well, Trump signed an executive order, and this was to discourage banks from debanking Bitcoin and crypto companies. Massively needed. I had another bank shut down my account. Now, I'm a controversial character. You know, I don't borrow anything, so I'm like the worst customer for a bank. They want you to be a debt slave. I don't have any debt. Bitcoin gave me the freedom to not need any debt. But I remember what it was like. They used to love me when I was a debt slave, as when I was working in the corporate and I had enough money to pay my interest, but never enough money to repay the debt. The banks loved me. So I was just talking about how the banks used to love me when I was deep in debt and could only afford to repay the interest. But they hated me as soon as Bitcoin made me free from debt slavery. And I started talking up against the banks and started talking about monetary reform and started helping people understand the proof of weapons network. And all of a sudden, I was going from bank to bank to bank. So, banks are a tool for censorship. And that's why we love Bitcoin so much. But to discourage banks from, taking out Bitcoin and crypto companies is a massive step forward. So I really support that initiative. And now we're looking at some of the other tools for oppression. Now, one of the first things that happens is if you do what you're told to do by the proof of weapons network rules, you're told that you need to go to university, get a good degree, and you need to go deep into debt and take on a student loan. And what do they do with those money? They charge extortionate fees. They accept lobby money to change the education to serve a corporate agenda. But also, these universities are essentially money laundering organizations for the proof of weapons network. And so it was really interesting to see one of the very established universities, Harvard University, is now buying $120 million worth of Bitcoin. And so we're even starting to see that the ultimate boycott, rather than we've got all these students saying, please don't send our money over to Israel. Please don't send our money to bombing children. And they're saying, okay, we'll buy some Bitcoin instead. And so maybe they can make up for the returns. And maybe we should be looking at how this changes the habits and the behavior. And so I've always seen Bitcoin as the ultimate tool for boycotting the proof of weapons network. And now we're starting to see, not because they've suddenly had a moral epiphany, but because it's more profitable. And so that's where you get the ultimate mix, where doing what's right is also more profitable because they don't give a damn about doing what's right, but they do give a damn about making more money. And so maybe we can de-weaponize the proof of weapons network as more and more people discover this. And so it looks like Harvard University is doing the same. Some new rules came out by the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission in the US, the CFTC, that's going to allow Bitcoin spot trading on futures exchanges. Trump also signed an executive order that was this Thursday, I believe, which is going to be allowing private equity, this was last week actually, real estate, crypto, and other alternative assets to go into your 401k. And this came out as an executive order. What that essentially means is that money managers are now going to be able to allocate money to what they called crypto. As a money manager, I'm hoping that means Bitcoin. You definitely don't want them to be gambling in the shitcoin casino with your retirement. You can do that yourself. But I've been talking about what I think this actually means, and I've been warning you about this. As I previously covered, they're basically doing a carrot and a stick. The carrot is that you get to put Bitcoin in your pension. And absolutely allowing for Bitcoin in your pension is the solution to the pension crisis. But in order to allow that, they're also giving you a stick, which is that private equity needs to go in there. And many of these universities, those endowment funds, Harvard's now buying Bitcoin. They're trying to get rid of their private equity because people are deciding they want to buy Bitcoin instead of private equity. And so they're stuck with this low liquidity in a debt-based Ponzi scheme as we're moving into more and more of this distress. We'll cover more of this in the macro. And remember, the tariff policy, as I've always covered, it was to make sure that you have distressed acquisitions of private stocks so they can be consolidated into the large multinational global institutions. And now they're looking to dump some of those stocks on your pension. And the fact that now you've got Bitcoin, which outperforms them, and then you've got some of these write-offs that are probably going to be coming from private equity. with complete conflicts of interest from the proof of weapons network, where organizations like Blackstone and various other private equity may be dumping them on your pension. Essentially, probably they're hoping that the Bitcoin returns means that you don't notice the bad investments with some of the private equity that may be happening as well. Because they know that the predictable upside is coming from Bitcoin. And then maybe they want these VCs pre-mined shitcoin gamblers in order to be able to leverage your money and various other things. We shall see. But all of this tells me, if you're handing your money over to Wall Street and the proof of weapons network, you need to become more conscious. And I know some people may not have actively made these decisions because very few of your retirements even allow you to have a self-directed. But if you can switch to self-directed and your employer will let you, then we need to take back control of as much as the fiat currency and the proof of weapons network, so we can direct the flow of funds into companies that are not committing genocide at the moment. So I looked at some stats in America right now based upon this to think, well, how many people are self-directing and what's the most likely outcome? And so here's a bit of a scenario. 20% of employers in the US offer self-directed 401ks. So that means 80% of you are handing your money over to the banksters and the economic hitmen to dump your private equity on your pension, and then they can make up some of it with Bitcoin. But of that 20%, 3% or less of eligible employees actually use it. So when you take that together, 20%, 3%, basically the self-directed 401k retirement account, it only represents a tiny, tiny amount of the whole 401k assets. There's about $9 trillion of assets, and only well under 1% of it, of the $9 trillion market, is self-directed. So 1% of a trillion is about, that market is about $10 billion. And so only about $10 billion is likely to be directed by somebody that understands Bitcoin hard talk if you're in one of those lucky positions. The rest are going to be dependent upon the pension fund managers. And those pension fund managers, I remember when I worked in the industry, they make decisions last. And so they will only get you into Bitcoin once probably the central banks get you into Bitcoin. But let's think about game theory a little bit. They'll probably firstly choose Bitcoin over crypto. They're going to definitely go into Bitcoin, allocate to Bitcoin, and I think it's highly unlikely that they will ever go into the whole crypto market. If they do, there's a bunch of hype around ETH at the moment because it's a host for stable coins and various other things. But I imagine probably one pension fund manager will start this off. I know because way back, I think it was 2015, I can't remember the year now, Jefferies Investment Bank asked me to go around all of the pension fund managers that are managing trillions and trillions of dollars of assets. And I gave them the Bitcoin pitch. And very few of them will actually make a move because they're very conservative around it. But I reckon one will make a move, and then you'll start to see that these pension funds will outperform everything else. I can't give financial advice. I can't promise this will happen, but historically, this is what's happened. Now, the past is not an indication of future, but I believe that the fixed supply of Bitcoin, the game theory works out. But I reckon that one pension fund manager will do like a 1% allocation, maybe a 2%. Maybe they get to a maximum of 5% allocation. And then really, after that, what could happen? Well, once they hit the top of the table, someone else will say, how do I compete with that? And when they have to compete with that, they'll look at doing an allocation. And even people like Ray Dalio, one of the most conservative hedge funds, like diversification, make sure you're prepared for everything. He's already recommending a 15% allocation to both gold and Bitcoin as well. And so you can imagine the game theory playing out here. So we've still got years to go, which means your job is still to own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, because you can front run all of this. You can move faster than their compliance teams can move. They're risk adverse. And so you get the reward of risk on as a result of where Bitcoin is today. And you get to boycott those Wall Street so you don't need them and outperform them anyway, because that's what historically has happened. So anyway, Wall Street's play is clear to me. It's very, very simple and obvious to me. They want your Bitcoin. They want you to custody with them. They want to use an ETF. They want you to use stocks. They want you to borrow against your Bitcoin. They want everything moving through their books. They want you using their trading platforms. They want you doing everything with them in their structured products because they want to steal your Bitcoin. And they will engineer a pump and dump. Ever since the creation of the Federal Reserve, they've done it 20 times. And there will be one with Bitcoin, and those in self-custody will be the ones that will be watching on the side and accumulating the cheaper Bitcoins at the same time as them stealing your Bitcoin. This is what Wall Street was created to do. This is what they will do. And they want your Bitcoin. And they're coming up with as many ways to try and get your Bitcoin. So what about America protecting itself? Do you remember the whole US Bitcoin Strategic Reserve? If we go way back, seems like such a long time ago, when we had Genocide Joe in charge of the US, and I was saying, you should probably vote Trump. There's like a 1% chance that he might do a few things. Firstly, he'll allow you to own your Bitcoin in self-custody. That's the victory. That's all you need. But there's less than 1% chance that he might release the Epstein files. He might release the 9/11 files. He might release the JFK files. He might expose the quote unquote deep state. And, you know, we got conversations around that, and I'll cover more about that in the geopolitical section. I also said that there may be a less than 1% chance that he builds his Bitcoin strategic reserves for America, and then they will issue some kind of stablecoin standard. Well, guess what? You're getting your stablecoin standard. I covered it in previous episodes, your covert central bank digital currency, thanks to the Genius Act, and you're getting a flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. Let's have a look at some of the flip-flops that we are seeing right now all around the world. So Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, flip. And so Trump's executive director of digital assets, Bo Hines, resigns out of nowhere. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed being a part of this crypto asset SAR position. I'm out of here and I'm going to go work somewhere else and try and build my own stack. Then you got an announcement this week from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Yes, the Scott Bessent that worked with George Soros to crash the pound and is now working with the US dollar, strategically crashing the dollar. He says that the US will not buy any more Bitcoin. I quote, instead, they're going to hold the $15 to $20 billion that they already have and look to seize more. So they stole Bitcoin and they hold it, and we don't even know. We don't know whether they've got $28 million worth of Bitcoin or they've got $20 billion worth of Bitcoin, because they pardoned Ross Ulbright, who they stole it from, and they owe $120,000 to Bitfinex after somebody hacked it from the 2016 hack, and now that's over in Department of Justice. And we're told that apparently there's $15 to $20 billion worth of Bitcoin. But somebody sent through a Freedom of Information request, and that showed that there was only about 28,000 Bitcoin. So allegedly we have, or the US has, that much Bitcoin, which is what Scott Bessent said, but they're not going to buy any more. They're going to seize more. I think that was the bit that he was not meant to talk about. So he literally went on television and said, guess what? We got this brilliant Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy. We're going to steal your Bitcoin. We're going to seize your Bitcoin and we're going to build our reserves. So the US Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy, the plan is here. They want your Bitcoin. And why is it that all these Bitcoin treasury companies are being built by the banksters, the fraudsters, the Howard Lutnick, Cantor Fitzgerald's, that are partnering with all these different people saying, hey, I've got an idea. Why don't we'll give you some shitty zombie public company. We'll borrow your name. You put your reputation on the line and we'll raise you a shitload of money to buy some Bitcoin. And these are the same types of people that are then saying, well, but what's your business model? Why don't you do borrow against your Bitcoin? Hey, we got a banking license. You can use our infrastructure in order to do that. And in the end, they'll create the pump and dump when they need to pull the rug on the dollar. When people stop buying those bonds, as we'll be covering what's happening in the macro section, they'll engineer a strategy so that they end up with your Bitcoin, and then they'll use that in order to back their stable coins and their banks, and is probably not going anywhere near the governments. And what are they going to do? A bunch of Bitcoin treasury companies will fire Chapter 11. They'll buy them for pennies on the dollar, and they'll get the Bitcoin at a discount, just like they did with FTX, just like they did with Celsius. The lawyers will take out billions of dollars in the bankruptcy, and they're engineering the strategy for you. And this is all more about centralization. They want those 17% of Bitcoin in those ETFs and in those Bitcoin treasury companies to be in the hands of fewer and fewer people. I think it was a Freudian slip that he said, we're going to try and seize as many of them from you. So immediately the call came through, hey, Scott Bessent, were you really meant to say that? I think we need to do a flop. And so flop, we got this tweet come out, I think it was yesterday, and there was a bunch of jargon around the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and that they've got these reserves. And there was a paragraph, Scott Bessent, quote, in addition, Treasury is committed to exploring budget-neutral pathways to acquire more Bitcoin, to expand the reserve, and to execute on the president's promise to make the United States the Bitcoin superpower of the world. Now, if you trust them, I've got a lovely war to sell you from the Proof of Weapons Network. When they rug pull your Bitcoin and give you a stable coin that's integrated with Palantir and a surveillance state where they can programmatically give you a negative interest rate and a collateralized debt obligation because you thought that the Trump administration was here to take on the deep state, when it turns out that the deep state brought this dude in. And if you haven't figured that already, you haven't watched enough Bitcoin Hard Talk. So here's what I will say to you. America, Trump ain't going to make America great again. Make yourself great again. Own Bitcoin in self-custody and allow them to do whatever they want so that you can protect yourself from them, because Bitcoin was a resistance against the Proof of Weapons Network, not a tool for the Proof of Weapons Network. And you are falling in with this MAGA flag thinking that he's going to make America great again, when they tell you everything you need when you follow the money. They're making themselves great again. They're accumulating as much Bitcoin as possible. They're building their Bitcoin strategic reserves because they know what they're doing to the dollar. They are annihilating the dollar. Trade policies is resetting the world order, and we're going to cover that in part 2 this week in macro. All they really want is to offload their treasuries on you by issuing these stable coins while triggering basically the screws on their surveillance state and making sure that they can control you. What else did we get as a flip-flop? Oh, we got a flip-flop from the Federal Reserve economic hitmen and banksters and financial terrorists as well. Flip. The Federal Reserve floats the idea that they're going to revalue gold. And they're going to take those $42 gold from, guess what? The last time they confiscated gold from you. Yes, they stole it all from you in the 1930s. And they haven't even audited it yet to tell you whether it's there. We know who owns it. It's the Federal Reserve that's got the obligations against that. And is the Federal Reserve America? No, it's not federal, and it doesn't have any reserves. It's owned by the banksters. And it's a public company. And they said that they're going to be taking the $42, because they stole all your gold and gave you up to $42 at the revaluation. Initially, it was $20. And once they had the gold, it went up to like $800, over $1,000. It's now approximately $3,400. And they said, you need to do it for your patriotic duty to make America great again. And did you make America great again? No, they created a debt-based Ponzi scheme to create more wealth inequality and more war and death and destruction so that you paid the inflation while they stole your purchasing power, kept the gold, and used it as collateral in order to fund a collateralized debt obligation to bomb children across the world in their colonial covert wars that we always cover as well. And so what they said they're going to be doing is that the Fed hinted that we could revalue that gold, but I thought it was treasuries. And yet the Federal Reserve is saying it might be something they're doing, and they could do it as a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Okay, sounds good. Flop. 24 hours later, Trump slaps tariffs on gold. And so basically, the prices are pushed up over $3,400 again because he's constricting the supply of gold, saying you can't bring gold back into America without paying a tariff. Huh? I remember it was Anthony Blanchard and his family that actually I invested in a gold Bitcoin company way back in the day because he made it where they could make gold ownership legal again in America. Now you slap a tariff on it. And so keeping gold out of the US is the strategy. It was done with a partner, with Switzerland, because the Swiss banks, the Swiss franc is increasing in value relative to the dollar. And what did it do? It pumped the price of gold up immediately. And so what happened after that? Flop. This suddenly announces that there are no tariffs on gold. This is perfect market for the proof of weapons network. Like the insider traders are coining it in. And so suddenly they're going to revalue gold and they're going to buy Bitcoin. Then they're going to slap a tariff on gold so it can't come back into America. And now there is no tariff on gold. And then they're announcing that the revenue... they're basically sorry, I didn't know what was notes is a little bit weird, huh? Yeah, this is a great trade for an investor. I had the notes saying two things at the same time. Now also remember, what was the executive order? What happened to that Fort Knox gold audit? We don't seem to know where the gold is, whether it can be audited, and it doesn't seem to be any word again. What about that sovereign wealth fund? Remember what I told you? You can only have sovereign wealth if you've actually got resources and a surplus. And so when you have a surplus, you build reserves, and you only get that if you keep your assets. You don't give it to the proof of weapons network. Now remember, America was started by a genocide so that they could take everyone off the land and they could hand over the oil over to the Rockefellers and all the private corporations. So America never got to keep its oil. And instead, they created a debt-based Ponzi scheme and a Federal Reserve and introduced income tax so that it could steal the money from you, steal the oil from you. But those countries that actually managed to resist colonialism and keep their own oil, even though they had to give half of it to you, like Saudi Arabia, in order to stop you bombing them and killing them, they managed to keep half of it, and then they managed to buy you out over time. And now they've got sovereign wealth. But how do you have sovereign wealth when you got world reserve currency, when world reserve currency means your largest export is the dollar, which is why America is 80% service-driven economy. The manufacturing base went to China, and you created the IMF to make sure that everyone got addicted to dollars because you wanted to inflict debt upon the world. This is why Ray Dalio is essentially saying that you need a 15% allocation to Bitcoin, and he's changed his tune over time. Bitcoin is eating the dollars market. It is eating fiat currency. It is eating the world, and they know it, which is why they want your Bitcoin. What else did we get? Well, remember what I told you at the beginning of this? Google. So Google did a little bit of fun and shenanigans this week as well. So if you look at the very top assets in the world, you got gold at 22 trillion. Then you got Nvidia at about 4.5, 4.2 trillion. Then you've got a few more stocks. You've got Apple, you got Google, you got Amazon, and then you have Bitcoin. Now we're head to head with Google at the moment. And then we move up to the next phase on the ladder where we look to take out Amazon or Apple. I can't remember which one it is. I think we've already taken out Amazon. Sorry, we got Apple next and we got Microsoft in the middle. So we passed Google as the 5th largest asset in the world. And I'm not saying that this was coordinated, but it was still pretty funny. Because what did Google do? Well, they learned from the US government, flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. So at the beginning of this week, they did a flip. And Google said that it is going to ban all unlicensed Bitcoin and crypto wallets in the US and Europe. What does that mean? What does that mean for self-custody? Because you can have a phone where they store the key. And while they can stop you downloading an app in the future, they can't stop you having an app that you've already downloaded. But then people will panic and say, but I've got my Bitcoin on my phone. What happens to my keys? And suddenly Bitcoin, Google can change the rules or Apple can change the rules. And people can panic and then they're trying to figure out how to self-custody because they were waiting until it's an emergency, except for the Bitcoin Hard Talk people. I got you covered. I'm going to make sure that you're ahead of it because you don't want to be subjected to what the Trump administration is doing, the Biden administration is doing, what China is doing, what Google is doing, what Apple is doing. They are middlemen galore that want to get in the middle of you and your Bitcoin because they really want BlackRock to own your Bitcoin. They want to make it inconvenient for you to own your own Bitcoin. This is the strategy. And this is why you must fight back. So what does that mean then? So that means that if there's a custodial wallet that is registered with the EU or a money transmitter in the US, then it's okay. But if you're a self-custody wallet, and you're just allowing people to own their own keys, then that's not okay. And that wallet can't really register as a money transmitter. And it's not meant to register as a money transmitter because they're just simply creating software for you to own your own key. But this is why you only want a small amount of Bitcoin on your phone. The rest of it should be stored in a secure self-custody hardware wallet and even a more sophisticated setup as your wealth grows. But basically, they said that suddenly that this rule only applies to EU and US residents. So if you live outside, then maybe you're okay. The idea is that you don't use your phone because if you use your phone to store your Bitcoin, you're going to be subjected to their rules. Now, there's ways around it. So now we had the flip. Suddenly, Google flipped on Bitcoin and crypto. And immediately, in the same day, they had to flop. So Google drops the plan to ban non-custodial crypto wallets from the Google Play Store following a massive backlash. But they're keeping it for custodial wallets. And so you need to understand this difference between self-custodial, custodial. The education to make sure you get this is more important than ever. How you store your Bitcoin is going to determine your level of freedom, freeing yourself from Google and freeing yourself from the Trump administration that wants you to have a collateralized surveillance stablecoin instead of Bitcoin and then hand over your Bitcoin to BlackRock. So what else happened right afterwards at the exact same time? Well, Google announced that they'd invested in TeraWulf. For those of you that don't know, TeraWulf is an awesome company. It's a Bitcoin mining company. And they bought a nuclear power plant. Now, it didn't scale. It was a very small nuclear power plant. But they managed to get a bunch of ASICs plugged into a nuclear power plant and mine at about half the energy costs with very renewable, efficient energy. And they managed to get like a full nuclear Bitcoin mining operation. And they're also diversified into hosting data centers for artificial intelligence. And so you've got nuclear mining combined with AI data. And in the future, there's going to be some really, really interesting thing about how you can repurpose and combine artificial intelligence with Bitcoin mining. Maybe we can even get a whole decentralized supercomputer, just like we have Bitcoin to host artificial intelligence data. All sorts of things are going to be coming. But anyway, Google decided to take, I think it was like an 8 to 10% stake in TerraWolf. So at the same time as flipping on Bitcoin, then flopping on Bitcoin, it was investing in Bitcoin mining. This was all done within one day. Now, what else did we have? We're talking about the China ban. Now, China was the original flip-flop, flip-flop, flip-flop. I mean, we've had so many bans on bans, bans on bans, bans on bans. In fact, China was most of the Bitcoin volume way back in 2013. And the major exchanges, like I remember there was Huobi, OKCoin, what was the other one? Huobi, BTCC. These were the major exchanges. They had all this wash trading and crazy volume for it. But, you know, China was a major player as well. And so they decided to do a flip this week. So already, even though 20% of the hash power is hosted in China and they're still mining Bitcoin, Bitcoin mining has been banned allegedly within China. And not only that, but the exchanges all left for like South Korea and Japan, and some are still there. Who knows what has to go on? But they apparently, Bitcoin exchanges are banned in China. But there was an announcement last week, which it was very hard to get confirmation. Some said it's true, some said it didn't. But on top of Bitcoin mining being banned and Bitcoin exchanges being banned, the announcement was that Bitcoin ownership is banned. And so the price on this barely moved. It barely moved. So now we're getting these China quote unquote bans. The people don't even care anymore. Before that used to be like a 40% correction in price. Now Bitcoin just sucks up Bitcoin. It's become so reliable that even the largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity, if they ban Bitcoin ownership, Bitcoin doesn't even care. So it's really interesting how resilient Bitcoin has come now. But in 2022, when that happened, I think it was 2021 when they reiterated the Bitcoin mining ban, and that created the whole Texas Bitcoin industry where people started innovating how to use wasted electricity. But it even led to a ginormous liquidation cycle. I remember there was a whole Terra Luna thing, and then there was the Bitcoin China mining and exchange ban. The price went crazy. That led to a liquidation cycle. Then you had all the bankruptcies, Operation Choke Point 2.0. You had the whole 2021, 2022 cycle. And it was a wild time if you lived through that. I think it pushed Bitcoin down from 69,000 to 17,000 at its bottom as well. So the moral of the story is that Bitcoin doesn't care anymore, and pay attention to anything that China bans because they has always been like the big market, the big geopolitical markets are the ones that get banned. And we know that it just leads to self-custody adoption. And we know that it's a ginormous geopolitical mistake. And we know that if Bitcoin doesn't have strategic reserves in America and Russia, China, BRICS, and the global south do, then there is a game theoretical scenario because maybe, just maybe, America is using these announcements to accumulate cheap Bitcoin, and maybe they're stacking for the country. Who knows? Maybe it's just a manipulation tool. But anyway, it would be a massive geopolitical strategic mistake if China were to do that. So, of course, immediately we get a flop. And so flip-flop, China is now going to be allowing the launch of the first crypto stablecoin reported in the Financial Times, despite the fact that Tether already had a CNY-backed stablecoin before. Can't remember whatever happened to that. But now China's going to be allowing for that stablecoin, and yet crypto ownership is meant to be illegal. You see the manipulative tactics that are happening here, but it doesn't matter. Just stack your sats in self-custody. If they do this, you get a massive exodus from China over to Singapore, over to the UAE, over to Japan. We've seen this time and time again. And an opportunity for another country, but it will also push people into self-custody. So the moral of the story of all of these different stories, hold your keys, skip the trading, don't worry about what they want you to do, avoid leverage, don't borrow against your Bitcoin. Nothing stops this train. The cat is out of the hat. The genie is out of the bottle. There is no putting it back in. And it's only a question of, what are you doing to protect yourself? You need to protect yourself, and you need to learn self-custody. And so I'm going to give you 2 final stories for part 1, and then I'm going to point you how you can step by step learn how to self-custody your Bitcoin completely free as my gift for you, because I want this to be a movement. And so this is the reason I'm doing this, is because many, many years ago, there used to be these stories. There was a guy, I remember, it was a guy in England. His name is James Howells. And for the last decade, he's been trying to get access to a junkyard place where they take all the rubbish. What's the word? I'm losing my words at the moment. But for 10 years, he's been trying to go to this tip. That was a word. Tip. That's an easy one. This rubbish tip, and get back a hard drive that he threw away that had approximately, I think it was 7,000 Bitcoin on it. He did every tactic under the sun. He wanted to share the reward with the tip yard. He wanted to co-opt the government into allowing it to happen. He wanted to raise money in order to buy the land so that he could then invest in an operation to get to the bottom of the yard. And in the end, he's just finally given up after 10 years. And so the Bitcoin hard drive that is currently worth $950 million today, that almost $1 billion, that will likely be $10 billion, maybe even $100 billion into the future, is lost forever. And 7,000 Bitcoins leave the supply, and they'll never be seen again, because he didn't look after his Bitcoin, and he bought them at a time when he just didn't care. So learn how to back up your Bitcoin. That is the important story. We need to learn from previous mistakes. And I also want you to know that the financial terrorists, yes, the Bank for International Settlements, yes, the one that funded Nazi Germany, the ones that worked with Reichsbank in order to put money and the gold from Czechoslovakia in the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve in order to fund Hitler's regime. Yeah, the one that created the European Union in order to make sure that Europe was controlled by the European Central Bank and European Union. That Bank for International Settlements, the one that's building the Mbridge and the central bank digital currency network. Yeah, those financial terrorists, they've decided that they're going to start marking Bitcoins. And so what they're going to be doing is the central bank of the central banks, i.e. the bank that is owned by the central banks, with one of the largest ones being the Federal Reserve at the moment, is proposing to create a grading system from 0 to 100 for each of your Satoshis. And this is going to be based upon transaction history. And so they're looking to scrape this data. If your score is low, then any companies or anyone that's interacting with those Bitcoin or those users can refuse to accept those Bitcoin. And they're claiming that it would be basically they can make tainted Bitcoin. They can link it, if it's ever linked to any type of illicit activities, then you need to make sure that you're receiving Bitcoin with the right score. And so if this were implemented globally, it could create basically a parallel market where clean Bitcoins are worth more than tainted Bitcoins. And they could have competing values and traded against each other. They would be marked in decentralized exchanges. And so the moral of the story is that when you store your Bitcoin in self-custody, there are different types of structures that you can set up so that every time you make a payment, it is made from a different wallet. And so now is the time for you to figure this out. So, Azad, I want you to play a quick video. What I've done is I've made a blog where I went through all of these points step by step. And I brought in my good friend, a OG in Bitcoin, wrote the book Mastering Bitcoin, Andreas Antonopoulos. He's been out there advocating for Bitcoin way back in 2013. And we did a project together once for some of our larger clients back in the day that wanted to learn how to self-custody. And with all these questions and with all these comments and with all these things that are happening right now, I wanted to open source that for anyone that has a login for free to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And so anyone that has a login can access this training. And what I've done is I've created a blog with a summary of all the points and all the things you need to know, with a link to where you can get access to 8 modules to go through all of this completely free within the membership portal. And now what I'm going to do is I asked AI to create a little 5-minute summary of a 30-minute video, which you can access on there. So Azad's going to play it right now. And then we're gonna pull up the blog and show you where you can go on simondixon.com in order to get this self-custody Bitcoin training 8 modules so that you can start to learn how to do this all properly. And I want to put that guide out there. So Azad, if you can play that video, and then we're going to move over to part 2, This Week in Macro.
Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so today we're really getting into Bitcoin self-custody. Basically how you can actually control your own digital assets. Think of it as your path up the, what's it called, the staircase of sovereignty, moving from relying on others to, full control.
Exactly.
And we're drawing heavily on the insights from Andreas M. Antonopoulos, particularly his book, Mastering Bitcoin.
A foundational text, for sure.
Our goal here is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Let's help you understand the key steps, the things to think about for self-custody. It all comes back to that saying, right?
Not your keys, not your coins.
Yeah.
It really sums it up perfectly.
It really does.
And what's really fascinating here is how different this is from traditional finance. It boils down to whoever has the cryptographic keys, they control the funds.
Your keys, your Bitcoin. Simple as that.
If someone else holds them for you, they're the custodian. They have the control. That slogan, yeah, it just nails it.
So, but it's not just like a black and white choice. Either full self-custody or nothing, relying totally on someone else. Andreas talks about hybrid options too, right? Things like multi-signature.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely non-binary.
How does that work, the shared control thing?
Well, hybrid multi-signature setups, or multi-sig, mean you can share control, maybe with a trusted third party, or even just between multiple devices you own, like your phone and a hardware wallet.
Okay, so it's a middle ground. More flexible.
Exactly. It offers more flexibility. And this brings up a really important question for you, the listener. Are you ready for that full responsibility? Or does some kind of shared control feel better?
Right. It's about trade-offs.
It is. Balancing risks and benefits, especially when you think about your own threat model, basically. What specific risks do you need to worry about based on your situation?
And security isn't usually just one magic fix, is it? It's more about layers of protection.
Always layers.
When we talk risks, I mean, they could be anything from targeted stuff like SIM hijacking all the way to, I don't know, floods or fires.
Sure, those exist. But what's the most common problem?
Yeah, what trips most people up?
That's the crucial part. While, yeah, threats can get really sophisticated, even state-level actors for some people, for most of us, the biggest risk in crypto is, honestly, losing access because of simple mistakes.
Like what?
Like forgetting passwords, misplacing your backup phrase, or just making your own security setup so complicated you lock yourself out. It really highlights why simplicity, where possible, is actually a security feature.
That point about simplicity is huge and often missed, I think. It kind of brings us back to the absolute core of it all, the keys themselves. How does Andreas explain what a key actually is?
He puts it very simply. A key is just a number, but an unimaginably large number.
Unimaginably large.
Think like astronomically huge.
Yeah.
The sheer scale makes it basically impossible for anyone to guess your key. It's effectively random.
Okay.
These massive random numbers generated by your wallet software are what you use to create your public address where people send you Bitcoin, and, crucially, to sign transactions. That signature proves you control the funds.
But managing a brand new key for every single transaction sounds like a nightmare for privacy, right? Is there a way to handle that better?
There is, thankfully. That's where hierarchical deterministic wallets, HD wallets, come in. Big name, simple idea.
HD wallets.
They use a single starting point called a seed. Think of it like a master key.
Okay.
And from that one seed, the wallet can generate billions and billions of unique keys and addresses. The huge advantage for you, you only need to back up that one single seed phrase.
Simplifies things a lot.
Yeah.
Better privacy, too.
Massively simplifies backup and management. Yeah, and enhances privacy because you're not reusing addresses.
And the seed, that's usually shown as the mnemonic phrase, isn't it? The list of words.
Precisely. The seed gets converted into a sequence of typically 12 or 24 ordinary English words. Much easier for a human to write down and handle than a giant number.
But easier to mess up writing down.
Well, the order is absolutely critical. Get one word wrong or in the wrong place, and it's useless.
So storing that phrase securely is paramount. Is just writing it on paper good enough? Or should people be thinking about, more durable methods?
Paper is simple, and it works for many. But yeah, for real long-term protection against things like fire or water damage, people often recommend engraving the words onto steel plates or something similar.
Okay, metal backups.
But the absolute golden rule, no matter the medium, never, ever create a digital copy. Don't type it into a computer. Don't email it. Don't store it in the cloud. Don't take a photo of it. Strictly offline.
Strictly offline. Got it.
And critically, make at least 2 copies. Store them in 2 different physically secure locations. Think geographic separation if possible.
Right. Redundancy is key there, too. Okay, so beyond single keys and seeds, we mentioned multi-signature schemes earlier. That sounds powerful for sharing control, or even just for one person managing, say, a phone wallet and a couple of hardware wallets.
Very powerful. It adds significant layers of security and control options.
So what's the most important thing for someone to keep in mind if they're setting up their own multi-sig, especially around control?
Yeah, multi-sig schemes are often described as K of N, meaning a transaction needs K signatures out of a total of N possible keys to be approved. A common setup is 2 of 3.
Okay, so any 2 keys out of the 3 designated ones can authorize sending funds.
Exactly. This gives you redundancy. If you lose one key, you can still access funds with the other 2, or it allows shared control. But the absolutely crucial point for you, if you're setting this up for self-custody, is to ensure you personally hold enough keys to reach quorum.
Quorum being the minimum number needed, like 2 and a 2 of 3 setup.
Correct. If you set up a 2 of 3 and you only hold one key while a third-party service holds another and maybe a lawyer holds the third, well, if that third party goes offline or becomes uncooperative, they hold one of the keys needed for your quorum.
So they could effectively freeze your funds.
Potentially, yes. It undermines the whole point of self-custody if you can't act independently. So make sure you control enough keys to meet the quorum requirement yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. It comes back to control.
It always comes back to control. And as we sort of wrap this up, it's really helpful to think of self-custody like Andreas frames it, that journey up the staircase of sovereignty.
Step by step.
Exactly. It's about building your comfort level, your technical understanding piece by piece. Maybe you start with a smaller amount on a phone wallet, a so-called hot wallet, before you think about moving larger amounts to cold storage, like a hardware wallet or that steel plate backup.
So you don't have to jump straight to the deep end.
Not at all. And what's fascinating is, even if full hardcore self-custody isn't your immediate goal, just understanding these concepts is vital, especially things like proper multi-factor authentication, moving beyond insecure SMS codes, for instance. That's crucial for managing any digital asset safely.
Yeah.
So it leaves a question for you listening. Considering your own specific circumstances, your own risk tolerance, what's maybe one small actionable step you could take, maybe even today, to move a little further up that staircase, to enhance your own digital sovereignty?
And some practical to think about.
Yeah. And of course, for anyone who wants to dive even deeper, the original creator of much of this thinking, Andreas M. Antonopoulos, has a wealth of resources available, online talks, books, articles, definitely worth exploring further.
Okay, awesome. Now, if that was a bunch of jargon, don't worry. I just wanted to give you a little bit of sample of the quality of what's covered in that training, because the way it actually works is we pull out a hardware wallet, we go through different scenarios, you gradually build up your self-custody confidence. And I just wanted to make sure that everybody has access, because I think we're really hitting that crucial stage. So in order to get access to this training completely free, on the screen right now, you should be able to see a blog. And this blog, I think if you head over to my blog and you put in custody, self-custody, you'll be able to find this if it's not at the top already. And you can find out. You can watch a 35-minute, a longer version of this, where we go through some of the key concepts and the mission of why you should self-custody. Hopefully I can inspire you to start this process and the importance of doing it. And hopefully everything that I covered, just what has happened in the last week, inspires you to start joining and boycotting and making a difference as we drain this swamp of the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network with a peaceful resistance through proof of work. And you can invest a little bit of time, get this skill for life, because I'm telling you, in a world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies and stable coins, you're going to need to resist. And it's only those that have Bitcoin that are going to be able to resist the ones that have it in self-custody. So on this blog, you can see there's a little button there. You can register to my Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. If you've got a login, the training's going to be there. If you haven't got a login, you can just get a login, enter your email and password. It will then send you a confirmation email to make sure it's a real email. You click on that, and then once you got your login, you can just, a bunch of other stuff is there, but one of the modules in there will contain the 8 videos on how to self-custody. And feel free to leave a comment in there. Let us know what you think. And we'll try and make more and more of this available for you as we go through this journey. Okay, so that's going to be everything on this week in Bitcoin, part 1. We covered a lot of angle. We covered the Google man, we covered the China ban, and we covered the Bitcoin strategic reserve and all of the different flip-flops and everything in between. Now, do me a favor. If you're enjoying this content, please do like, please do subscribe, please add a comment below and let me know what types of things you'd like me to be covering in the future. I do read those comments. And if you're on YouTube, head over to Rumble, because if we get taken down or they get lightning payments and YouTube doesn't continue to get on the right path, we may flip over to Rumble. So please follow me over there. Also, I'm on podcasts so that you can listen to this in the background when you're driving or in the gym. You can go on Apple and type in Bitcoin Hard Talk, or you can do the same on Spotify if you're an Android user. Or you can access it from my blog as well and download on the podcast section. And finally, make sure you got that membership to Bitcoin Hard Talk. It's a free membership portal. I'm going to make sure that we add as many resources, and I want to make sure that we got a community that is self-custodying. And finally, follow me on X. I go live. I've been doing Monday to Thursday, answering people's questions and going through daily news as well. So make sure you're following me on X, and I'll continue to do these on Bitcoin Hard Talk. So with that in mind, let's now move over to part 2. In part 2, we're going to be covering US debt, US inflation, the China trade war, and everything that's happening in between, and how all the tariff policies are tying together. And so we're going to jump straight in to this week in macro, part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 93. Did Google and China ban Bitcoin? Right, so let's take a look at some of the stats. A lot of economic data is coming out. The trends that we've been covering over the long term in Bitcoin Hard Talk are becoming more and more clear. And I'll go through some of those trends. Now, firstly, let's have a look at the US national debt. So now, for the very first time in the last couple of weeks, the US national debt has officially passed $37 trillion for the very first time in history. Obviously, every debt is a new first time in history. It sounds very dramatical, but $37 trillion. This basically puts total US debt up by $780 billion since the debt ceiling was raised, which was done with the Big Beautiful Bill, the signing of the Big Beautiful Bill under the Trump administration, and that was only on July the 4th. $780 billion since July the 4th. This basically equates to an average rise of $22 billion per day. The US national debt is increasing at $22 billion per day from the Trump administration, whose whole promise was to get a trade surplus and pay down the national debt, and is now going into more debt than the Biden administration, because anyone that watches Bitcoin Hard Talk, you never got fooled by that for a section, because you know that the dollar is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and as soon as you start paying down the debt, you constrict the money supply and you crash the whole economy. Debt has to go up exponentially forever in a debt-based Ponzi scheme until you tackle monetary reform, not tax reform. And so last week alone, the government basically sold 725, this is in 1 week, $1 billion of treasuries through 10 auctions. They had to do 10 auctions to sell $750 billion of a debt-based Ponzi scheme. The US household debt, it jumped by $185 billion in Q2 2025. So now, US households, of the 330 million Americans, you now have $18.39 trillion of debt. That is what happens when the dollar is debt and the interest to repay the debt doesn't exist. And the only way to repay that debt is to issue more debt, both on the consumer level, the corporate level, and the government level. The government is done through wars. The corporate is done through financial engineering, and the closer you are to the money printer, the cheaper the interest you get, 0%. The further you are from the money printer and you're spending on consumption, you pay like 40% payday loans and 27-30% credit cards. And if you spend it on consumption rather than assets, you're wrecked by the system, because the system is designed to extract wealth from those that don't own assets from those that are in debt. And that's why they need you to be in debt. You are the money supply. And it is the banks that profit from every loan in that $18.39 trillion of consumer debt. This basically puts total household debt up by $592 billion in just the last year. This surge was driven by mortgages. And so obviously people are becoming debt slaves for life. And Bitcoin is the new mortgage. Like, the next generation that couldn't get on the property ladder are trying to figure out how to beat the market so that they can take on a mortgage and be a debt slave for life to drive the profits of the proof of weapons network. And mortgage debt rose $131 billion in the second quarter. That is $12.94 trillion of mortgages. You are the product. You are creating the dollar, but the banks get the profit and you get the enslavement. And hopefully your real estate beats the market, but Bitcoin beats that anyway and drains the swamp. And so they want to get your Bitcoin so that you can borrow against it. Anyway, what about credit card debt? Credit card debt is up $27 billion in the same time period. That's $1.21 trillion of dollars were created by you swiping that card, just shy of a complete all-time high. What about students? Students, you're the product. They need you to start buying those degrees so that you can go into debt, so that you can take on the mortgage, so that you can take on the credit card, so that the banks can make all the money of the dollar. And if you consume it, you're a slave to them for life. So student and auto loans debt, it has now climbed to $7 billion in the same time period. That's up $13 billion to $1.64 trillion. And auto loans as well. That's the student debt. Auto loans is another $1.66 trillion as well. And both of those are all-time high records. So while artificial intelligence is teaching you what a degree could never teach you, you're taking on more and more student debt that takes 3 years, that in that whole time you could have been adjusting to AI, stacking more Bitcoin every month, and instead you're stacking more debt every month, getting further behind, and hoping that the government inflates away your debt. Americans are piling on the debt. The entire economy is based upon debt, which is why BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network are pivoting to the countries, because you're so enslaved by debt that you can't afford to have children. And when you can't afford to have children, they need a workforce. They need to replace you with artificial intelligence and robots, and they need to work with the global South and the countries that are still having children as well. Which is why there is no America first agenda. There is no Europe first agenda. There is no UK first agenda. So what is happening with all of this debt? Well, we covered it in a couple of weeks ago, consumer price index inflation. Nothing was really happening there. We're waiting to see the impact of tariffs. But this week we had the producer price inflation. And the producer price inflation, while the consumer price inflation was about 2.7%, so it's rising above the 2% target, the producer price inflation was 3.3%. That is significantly higher than expected. That's why we had a correction in the market. And just so you know, this is the cost of goods for businesses that are producing goods. The vast majority of the American economy is services, so it doesn't really impact those people there. But if you're a business and you're producing goods, the price of those goods is going up, and it's now 3.3%, significantly higher than expected. Now, this is normally a leading indicator to what consumer price index will be. Imagine if all of the goods prices are going up to produce a good, then you can imagine they're going to start passing on some of those costs and charge increase in prices. And so normally this indicates that we're going to have consumer price inflation, currently 2.7%, but it's likely to go higher as well, above the 3%. Now, there's not a perfect science to that as well, because when you are enslaved and indebted, where 1% control all the wealth, and there's about 10% that do the vast majority of all the consumption, and 90% are just living and meeting standards, and about 60% are living month to month as debt slaves, then you can imagine that when you put prices up, you just can't afford it anymore. So the top 10% will buy whatever the price is. They're price inelastic, is called in economics. They don't care. Whatever the price is, they'll buy it because they got the money. But those that can't afford it, they just essentially stop consuming. And so it may not necessarily be that it turns into consumer price inflation, because it may crowd out demand. And this is called demand destruction. And demand destruction impacts businesses. And then you have a deflationary effect, where the price of goods go down because there's less goods, or there's too much money chasing too few goods if they do a monetary stimulus like the Trump administration has been doing with all these auctions. And so you may get some offsetting effects. But anyway, that's what the inflation, I'm still expecting inflation to continue in the direction as a monetary phenomenon, and also a one-time reaction over the next year or so to the tariffs, depending on what happens with those tariffs as well. The issue is that when inflation is going up and stocks are going up, there's no real justification for the Fed to cut rates. Now, Trump wants the rates to be cut because he wants to roll over all the debt with short-term treasuries and refinance, so you're paying less interest. It's still a debt-based Ponzi scheme, but he's trying to do that. So the Federal Reserve cutting rates is the complete opposite of what their mandate does. And if they do that, because Trump is asking for massive rate cuts, essentially the rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. And if you don't own any assets, then you're going to be on the wrong side of this further and further which drives America further and further into civil unrest. And so that's the strategy that the Trump administration is following. The Trump administration wants to pump the stock market, which is essentially tariffs are a subsidy on American consumers. And if you end up using monetary policy to pump the stock market anyway, then you're transferring wealth from Main Street to Wall Street all over again. And so with this goal in mind, what is Trump doing? Well, he announced and nominated his new person to enter the Federal Reserve. And there's another 3 people that will be retiring. And then there's going to be the new chairman to replace Jerome Powell, who has to retire, I think, in June next year. And so there was an announcement that Dr. Stephen Moran is going to be replacing one of those people that wanted to cut rates for Trump, but instead stepped down. And now we've got a new vacant that Trump has been essentially put to that role. So what do we know about him? Well, we know that he's pro-Bitcoin. He's been posting posts on X around Bitcoin. So we've now got people in the Fed that are pro-Bitcoin. We know that Moran, from his previous papers, he has a very aggressive stance on rates and basically, different trade policies as well. Way more aggressive than Jerome Powell. And I think he could be potentially a movement towards the shadow Fed chair. And what that means is that the market will react to what they think the Fed will do when Jerome Powell steps down, and therefore whatever Jerome Powell does is useless, which means that he's much less likely to decrease those rates, even though there is a high percentage that in September you'll get a token rate decrease. But it won't do anything because it's the long-term rates that matter. And then we may have this shadow Fed chair. He's proposed radical changes in the Federal Reserve. So as we're moving to this stablecoin standard, and the Genius Act allows banks to turn their reserves at the Federal Reserves into stablecoins. I covered that a couple of weeks back in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 92. And I believe that he has a policy of a weaker dollar. And so pushing down the value of the dollar is the stated goal, I believe, from what we can tell based upon his previous papers as well. And so we're expecting to get an announcement of the shortlist of the shadow Feds or people that would take the role. And I think he was going to put out 11 people, and people will ignore it, and people will speculate. But we may get an announcement anytime soon. And really, what does that do? Well, it basically removes the long-term policy of Fed independence. And Fed independence means that it could be very bearish for the dollar. And the cost to borrowing, if you want to lend to the government for 10 years and 30 years, is likely to go up if this actually happens. So this is a great MAGA narrative. You can say, I'm taking on the Fed. We're going to replace it, and we're going to make America great again. And we're going to take down the Fed. And Treasury is going to be issuing these stable coins. But it's a significant weakening of the dollar, which if you've been watching any of my content, I've said Trump is installed to move the world to multipolar world, to make America more isolationist, and to have massive destabilization campaigns based upon a MAGA narrative. And I'm not going to go through that again. I've covered that so many times. So what is Trump saying? He wants a 300 basis point rate cut. Never been done before. Unprecedented. The Fed has never been doing it. But does this make it more likely to happen? Maybe. We can speculate. But now, even though inflation is on the rise and stocks are on the rise, and there's no justification for decreasing rates based upon the data, the poly markets and the betting markets and the markets are saying there is a 93% chance that the Fed will cut rates in September. So it's highly likely to be either a quarter cut or a half, 500 basis. But the market might start moving as if Fed independence is no longer there. That all ties into the dollar destabilization campaign. and many of the different things that I believe is happening that seem to be rolling out right now. So in line with the destabilization campaign, what have we had this week and maybe even last week? Let me just try and catch up. It's virtually impossible to keep up to date with this stuff. So I'm going to try and do some of it for you, but by no means is all of this. You'd have to follow me on X, where I go live every single day and do live spaces where you can come up and ask me questions to really get this in real time, because it's moved so fast that even I can't keep up. So here we go. This week or last week or however, I can't keep up anymore. Trump has doubled tariffs on Indian imports by 50%. He has also added a new 15% tariff on Japanese goods. He has declared a 100% tariff on semiconductors, the most important strategic asset for both military and tech. He exempted South Korea and Taiwan from these. And so really it was just targeted at China. But China doesn't really export any of them to America. So it's completely meaningless. It's just a destabilization campaign anyway, because they're not being exported to America. He warned that pharmaceutical tariffs are going to be as high as 250% and that they're on their way. And while adding a tariff on India, which is the country that America is dependent upon for its pharmaceutical products and drugs, as well as being dependent upon China for its rare earth minerals and Taiwan's for its semiconductor chips. He managed to essentially take the DXY, the dollar index, against a basket of other currencies, mainly the euro, the Swiss franc, and the Japanese yen, and various other currencies, that had a rebound above 100. He managed to get it below 100 again and back under because of these destabilization campaigns. So it had a big rally up and then came straight back down. It's now playing around the $98 level as well. The stock market did not give a damn. It continued to have crashing stocks for the majority of stocks. We're talking big names. So the American companies are suffering, but the tech companies are crushing it, pushing up the entire index and consolidating more and more of the S&P 500 into the S&P 10. Now, the bond market does care. The bond market is the truth. You can't fool the bond market. And so we said that there were all of these auctions in order to refinance the debt. We had the largest issuance of 4-week bonds in US history. So more of the debt is being refinanced into 4-week bonds, which are going to have to be refinanced again in another 4 weeks. And we also had a $42 billion 10-year auction. So that's the 10-year bonds that want to lend to the US government. They had to sell at a discount in the Dutch auction. So the demand just wasn't there. Now, because it's a Dutch auction, they always get sold out. But you can read a little bit more into it. International buyers were significantly down. That means America is refinancing on itself, onto its banks, onto its primary dealers, onto its pension funds, onto its Cayman Island funds, rather than foreign companies. So it's having to be repackaged onto itself and onto Americans. So you are the product if you're contributing to your pension as well. There was an increase in the basically the buyers of last resort. That's the primary dealers. So the primary dealers, they commit to stepping in if the demand isn't there. There was a massive increase in terms of the numbers that were in the primary dealers as well. And so that is the first signs of these auctions being highly stressful, which is why they're pushing through all these stable coins and they're trying to do radical monetarism as we enter into this fiscal dominant strategy of Trump trying to spend its way through stimulus and pump the market and push the wealth inequality gap further and further and further away as the debt gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Right. Now, isn't the trade policy meant to be taking down China? So let's have a look. I said that the tariff policy would draw everyone closer to China. and that China could outlast America in a trade war massively, because only 15% of China's economy is exports to America. And China has been working on its Belt and Road Initiative in order to not destroy countries, but to invest in companies, make them more vassalized and dependent, a bit like the IMF strategy. But instead of doing the IMF strategy, allow the countries to do what they want to do and build up their own infrastructure rather than IMF loans to completely destroy the economy. This is driving people to closer relationships with China after decades and decades of IMF economic hitmen from America. And so what is happening now? Well, China's surplus, which was meant to be hit by tariffs, is surging. Remember what I said? This will draw people closer to China and get it less dependent upon the American economy so it can be more isolationist, while the global institutions gobble up all of the companies that are going to be distressed, the smaller companies that are having mass bankruptcies right now. And China will continue to grow. And so their surplus is surging. So China's overall global trade surplus reached a record of $1.2 trillion over the last 12 months during this quote unquote trade war. Now, I said China had already won the trade war, and Trump was installed in order to put the MAGA narrative on the fact that America was losing the trade war in order to reset the world order to the multipolar world order that is emerging right now. But their positive trade balance has essentially doubled over the last 5 years. So the trend has just continued, and it's doubled over 5 years. This comes as China's essentially exports have significantly rebounded even after the trade policy. And this is excluding the US. So it is increasing without the US as well, which is what I said it would exactly do on Liberation Day and beyond. The cumulative 12-month exports for the world right now, and if you exclude the US, they have increased by $400 billion to a record $3.2 trillion over the last 18 months, over the Biden administration, over the trade tariff policies, and over the trade war to where it is right now. Now, you could say China manipulates numbers, and there's an element of truth to that, just as America manipulates numbers, but China is not subjected to the same audit requirements. And so you can take these numbers with a grain of salt, but directionally it's obvious. So additionally, China's cumulative 12-month manufacturing surplus hit a record of $2 trillion, which is well above the largest surplus historically seen in Germany and Japan. So Germany is destroying its manufacturing base. Japan, during its peak, when it was creating all these trade surplus, it still has massive trade surpluses. Even despite the debt, which makes it different to America. America has the world reserve currency, a twin fiscal deficit and trade deficit, which is pretending to pay off, but it would crash the world. China has its debt to itself in an internal banking system without a debt-based Ponzi scheme because it's got a state banking system, but massive trade surpluses and reserves. Whereas Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, but it has massive asset surpluses, but America doesn't have those. Now, yes, it has a growing productive economy through its industry, but it's not the interest rate on its debt is faster than its growth, which is why we're in this spiral where America's basically trade deficit is where it was during the Great Depression and during wartime. And it's its record of 6%. Without the manufacturing base that it had in order to recover the economy. So China is essentially expanding global trade amid US tariffs. Exactly what I said it would do. And I said US Liberation Day is liberating the world from the dollar. And we covered some of the de-dollarization slow trends as well. So what did China do in reaction to this? China ordered basically its tech companies, including ByteDance and Alibaba, and Tencent, which are their large equivalents of Google and everything as well, and Amazon, basically to suspend the NVIDIA chip purchases, even though Trump signed off on exporting those chips to China because it wanted to subsidize its GDP and increase the stock price of NVIDIA. And China came along and said, stop buying them. It's a national security risk. We don't trust those chips. And so obviously they have something going on in terms of their own chips, or whatever it is that they're working on. Now, all that tariffs have done is, yes, there has been an increase in revenue for America, which is $350 billion, but Americans and American companies paid for it. So this is a tax and wealth transfer from the American people to the American government. So it's a tax increase so far. And that's the impact as well. Now, what else is it doing? It's concentrating the small to medium-sized enterprises that are having record bankruptcies into the larger corporations. That's what I said, because the larger corporations, they got global trade routes. They're able to circumvent these tariffs, and they're able to rejig as well. So the top 10% largest US stocks now reflect a record 75% of all the US equity market. So you're getting massive concentration in stocks, consolidation of power into monopolies, and guess what? They're all BlackRock's portfolio companies as well. So this has officially surpassed the previous record before the Great Depression in the 1930s in terms of stock concentration, which was the debt-fueled bubble that is the Trump administration's policy, a debt-fueled bubble of the stock market. So by comparison, in the 2000 dot-com bubble, which is when my father lost all of his money in the dot-com boom and bust, and then that sent me into this obsession of studying money and going to uni and working in investment banking and working in and then leaving for monetary reform and eventually finding Bitcoin, trying to create a bank and the whole story. That was all based upon my father losing all of his money when he asked me, son, what happened to my money? I was broke he was broke in World War II, being bombed in the UK, had no money, he was the son of a bus driver. And he managed to break from the cycle without debt, become a self-made millionaire. And then he lost it all in the stock market because he didn't understand the proof of weapons network. And that drove my obsession, kind of made me where I am. He passed away actually on the 12th of June, 2022, which was the day when Operation Choke Point 2.0 and the ex-Mossad agent, the ex-IDF soldier, Alex Majinsky, stole all that money in a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme with the hacks from Netanyahu, and the Celsius came down, and then you had the whole liquidation cycle. And then I spent 2 years trying to work with all the victims of that, like I did the Bitfinex hack victims in 2016. This was a 22,000 dot-com bubble. And that's exactly what it looks like at the moment. So back then, when we had this massive deleveraging event, pump and dump cycle, 10% of shares were only 73%. So this was slightly less, but very similar. In the 1980s, after the stagflation environment and the savings and loan crisis that followed, this was basically below 50%. And that was too leveraged as well. So meanwhile, the top 10 stocks in the S&P 500 now represent about 40% of the entire S&P index and the market capitalization. So this is massive monopolies and massive concentration of power. And that is what BlackRock wanted to do when essentially the banks and the financial industrial complex said, let's put Trump in, let's do the tariff policy, and let's reset to the multipolar world order. And obviously Trump's allowed to get rich out of it. And let's change to this technocracy and surveillance state and introduce not a Bitcoin strategic reserves as covered in part 1, but a stablecoin that is a covert CBDC, as I've often covered as well. Anyway, what about real estate? There is massive consolidation of real estate into fewer and fewer banks. And so rather than having community banks, you're having community banks going bust, gobbled up by less and less banks. So less and less productive lending, more and more mega lending, which is rampant corruption, and more consolidation of power so that the large institutions the government becomes subordinate to them. But we're starting to see more and more distressed acquisitions from managing of funds because you're handing your pension over to BlackRock rather than buying Bitcoin. So they're pushing up. The Federal Reserve still has $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. If they sold them, houses would be affordable for a lot of people. But instead, you got to buy Bitcoin to outperform it, and then you can eventually buy your house with Bitcoin. It's the only way to beat the market that I know of. And so we're now getting announcements that there's going to be an IPO in order to merge Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yes, that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the institutions that were privatized, socialization, the privatization and socialization. Let me get this right. The socialization of losses and privatization of gains. I did it. Got that one right. And so they're essentially dumping all of these federal toxic assets and mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps by doing a merger of them, which may lead to efficiency improvements, at the same time as making it public as well. Maybe they end up in your 401k, as real estate is now allowed because there's an executive order. Can you see how the lobby controls everything and the politicians are there to wrap it up in a narrative that's acceptable to you? So we're now seeing this massive concentration of these toxic assets and mortgage-backed securities, keeping the price, keeping the real estate Ponzi going. We're seeing basically what the destabilization campaign is federal power is being reduced by the proof of weapons network. And we're having this concentration of power that is governing these different networks. And I think federal power is being removed, which was what backed the dollar. It was all the corruption. The proof of weapons network is being privatized. State federal power is being transferred to corporate power, which is exactly what the European Union was, exactly what the European Central Bank was, and exactly what happened to UK and Europe when the colonial power started imploding on itself to beta test it for what it's currently doing in the US. And this is why we're getting the isolation of the US. This is why tariffs are happening. And this is why we're getting an increasingly more unstable environment. And the narrative to make it acceptable is MAGA in the case of the US. And obviously the proof of weapons network is hosted in the US, so it impacts us all. But I think all these trends are happening that I've been saying are the long-term trends as we cover them each week. Now, what is also interesting, remember those that say, Simon, isn't this a conspiracy theory? Basically, BlackRock has become the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. We've seen this model before, but now it is public company through BlackRock and has created this unaccountable power structure where governments are subordinate, and it can do its colonial expedition and push wars and control the deep state and even have the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is owned by the banks and the banks are owned by BlackRock. If you want to understand how the proof of weapons network, go to my blog on simondixon.com, put in proof of weapons, and you'll see a blog there with a summary and a breakdown of everything. Now, everyone says, but isn't this a cabal or isn't this a conspiracy theory? And I tell people, no, it's just follow the money. That's what I do every single week. This is how it works. You were just lied to all along. Okay. All right. So the story I was covering, let me just go right back to the beginning of the BlackRock story. Basically, there was a federal judge ruling in Texas that ruled that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street can be sued, and they basically are being sued for forming an investment cartel. Now, this is what people called me a conspiracy theorist for. When I was just telling you, we've seen this throughout history. It's not my fault that you think your government control are in charge. It's not my fault that you haven't figured out that the way more powerful force is the corporate interest and has made government subordinate to it. And they control the deep state, and they use this in order to prop up the dollar in a debt-based Ponzi scheme called the proof of weapons network. But essentially, during this Texas ruling, I got AI to give me a little bit of a summary because the document was very long. But basically, the little summary it gave me is that the case was that the State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock are controlling the US energy markets. So these things that I said are now been ruled. Not so conspiracy theory now, is it? People that always debate me around how this is, some crazy conspiracy theory. So what the case said is that the lawsuit says that they bought BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard were buying coal companies, and they were buying them just to shut them down, and they were forcing them into green energy mandates. And then they would jack up the prices based upon these mandates, and then they would push an ESG narrative and an ESG policy in order to reset the flow of capital, and then nobody voted for it. And then it basically would go deeper, and it was using the exact same follow the money trends that I talk about every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk. So it's great. This is exactly what happened when I was fighting Celsius. Everyone called me a conspiracy theorist. And then in 2 years, it eventually all came out in court documents. And now we're seeing the same at the very highest level with the proof of weapons network. They're not calling it the proof of weapons network, but it's exactly the same. So BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, they own Tyler Tech, which was basically banned for corrupt, doing corrupt reassessments to manipulate valuations. Who were the major shareholders? It was Amazon, and it was Costco. They're the major shareholders in them. And they were using massive tax breaks by treating it like a network as well. And so at the same time as US taxes going up for everybody, they were able to use the proof of weapons network in these court rulings in order to use Ireland and various other jurisdictions to pay no tax. They indirectly own shares in Demerva Power, and this is through their position in ExxonMobil. And this is why prices of energy were going up. They were manipulating oil prices, working with other forces. This led to skyrocketing bills. Who else do they own? They own shares in NVR, Ryan Homes, and this is basically buying farmland, pushing up unaffordable development projects. And these are the exact type of where I said that they create wars, rebuild, get rare earth mineral deals. They act like a cartel. The financial industrial complex negotiates with the military industrial complex, and they install changes with the technical industrial complex. They get Americans into debt to have the consumption industrial complex, and then Big Pharma gets everyone addicted to drugs through the pharmaceutical industrial complex. This is like a ruling exactly in line with the proof of weapons network that some people say is a conspiracy theory. They have a heavy stake in Chesapeake Utilities and Ephrasia Water, and so they control assets. They ruin economies. They push them into distressed asset sale. They strip out the assets that are core to the country. They create destabilization campaigns, open borders, deportations. They have privatized prison industries. They have privatized militarization. This is what we're seeing. All of this was, showed in that. And so they have these water companies. They have these monopolies where they can hold the countries to ransom. It's just basically a triangle of a profit scheme. And exactly as I said, financial terrorism. They control land, they control utilities, they control politics. They use lobby in order to push out the proof of weapons network. They get to have the companies that benefit from printing the money. They get to push everyone into debt through all of this debt enslavement schemes. And it's all controlled by the same few players, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And if you read my blog where I said, but when you talk about the proof of weapons network, aren't you talking about the Jews? And I told them, no, look at the myths. That's the blame shift. They weaponize ideology to recruit armies. They'll weaponize Christianity. They'll weaponize Zionism. They'll weaponize Muslim invasion. They'll fund groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. They'll fund militias. And they're using the same techniques on the West right now that they've been using all along through the covert regime change and operations. So it's not a conspiracy anymore. It's now backed up by federal rulings. So it's good to see that following the money actually works. And it's why so often at Bitcoin Hard Talk, we're able to share with people things that people would just find unreasonable normally. It's just because they don't follow the money. And by the way, if you buy into the Jewish conspiracy theory that they all rule it, check out my blog that I created. Just put Jews in the blog section, and I go through the real data, follow the money. Look at the IMF, look at all the accusations, look at the banks, look at who's controlling them, look who actually benefits, look at the religious ideologies that are weaponed. We got to get to the truth in order to get to the solution, because they like to obfuscate reality so that you can't see what's happening right in front of you. So this is the proof of weapons network that I've always been describing. And what is the stated goals, I believe, that we're seeing by following the money? And that is that Europe and the UK are getting worse and worse and worse. The proof of weapon network is fully in control of those governments, is turning the entire region into distressed, toxic assets, just like it had done with the IMF in the global south and the Middle East and Asian regions and Latin America. It's turning them into distressed, toxic assets for acquisition. You only need to look at what numbers did we get from Germany. Their manufacturing industry is down 2%. They're making ever more stupid moves, and MERS was installed because it's harder to vassalize Germany because they have their own manufacturing base. But this is why the proof of weapons network gets involved in political interference. They fund the media, and they make you think that the trends that you're seeing are the things you need to focus on so that they can turn your country into a toxic asset. And this is the largest decrease since COVID. COVID was an operation. I'm not even sure if we're allowed to say that anymore. And so we're getting the Bank of England cutting rates to 4% at the moment, trying to stimulate growth. We had a massive exodus leading into October in the UK. All of the millionaires leaving, all of the billionaires leaving people that the tax revenue is decreasing. We're getting people that are creating their own private security because the police aren't doing their jobs anymore. They're implementing exit taxes so that if after October you can't leave the country without giving them all of your assets as well, and a percentage of your assets, they're doing what America did. America made it where you can't leave. You just have to pay tax forever. And so they're all leaving before, because they can't do it in backward. They can only do it forward. And where are they all heading? They're headed to the UAE. They're headed to the Middle Eastern countries. And where is UAE? UAE is a member of BRICS. BRICS, the same BRICS that Goldman Sachs talked about in order to isolate America, reset the world order into a multipolar world order, because America is just simply the host nation for the capital market. And now they control government and they install the politicians, and Trump is there to deliver that reset in the world order. We're seeing already that as a result of this, as a result of Trump's tariffs, Brazil, India, and China, they're basically all coming together and they're deciding we're going to respond to tariffs in a more unified approach. Now that they're doing their trade deals together without the dollar, they're doing de-dollarization in terms of their multilateral trade agreements. And Russian President Putin basically immediately after Trump said we'll put the increased tariffs on India, went to visit India. And so immediately you had a close, more close ties with BRICS rather than the traditional thing. And then what are you seeing from BlackRock? BlackRock is getting Trump to negotiate deals to asset strip Americans so that all of the money is consolidated into the top stocks. India then basically came out and said that it's now not going to buy US arms. It's got a plan in order to, basically halt the purchasing of all those weapons that it was buying. And BlackRock gets to manage its portfolio into the different areas. And then guess what? A new trade deal will be done, which means that the tax revenue doesn't come in, but the large companies get the deal anyway that they were looking for. And again, Main Street pays, Americans pay, you get the inflation, and then the deals go up to the top as well. India said that it's not going to be buying multiple aircrafts. It's not going to be buying vehicles. It's not going to be buying missiles anymore. India's defense minister came out and canceled its plans to visit the US. Remember Apple as well. We were told that Apple is going to relocate away from China and start building its manufacturing base in India. So first, Apple decided that it's going to begin moving the iPhone production away from China and over to India. And that was to avoid the 140% tariff that was then reversed immediately, and we got the extension. 1 month later, we're told that Trump is now threatened to impose a 25% tariff on iPhones that are not made in the US. And so then Apple suddenly reacts and says, okay, we won't build in India. And so as soon as this situation is settled down, Apple decided that it's going to announce a $600 billion investment in the US to support Trump's trade initiatives. But what is that going to do? There's massively more expensive iPhones, and the vast majority is going to be negotiated out through its large multinational corporations. And essentially, the increase in the price of iPhones is the consumer will pay, and it goes to the government. You're making the government bigger. This is increasing the size of government, and it's not even paying down its debt. It's one big, ginormous debt-based Ponzi scheme to prop up the final parts of the proof of weapons network while all the politicians are exiting into Bitcoin and giving America no Bitcoin strategic reserves. So hours later, Apple decided to release the news that tariffs on India is basically rising. I think the administration said they're rising to 50%. Because India is buying oil from Russia, and yet they're buying it for Europe, and America can't produce the oil that it's saying in these numbers. We've covered all of that last week or the week before. I don't want to go through that again. And so basically months and months of, doing these, sitting down, is, shutting down manufacturing from China, deciding that it's going to be doing plans to relocate to India. The entire initiative is basically effectively made worthless by a single executive order based upon the whims. This is the destabilization campaign. And then Apple just sits down with Trump and, signs a memorandum of understanding. But I think we understand, if you watch Bitcoin Hard Talk, that it's not going to be anything that they're telling you anyway. So all this to say, this is playing out exactly as we covered in Bitcoin Hard Talk. We said Liberation Day will be liberating the world from the dollar. And so you're getting the consolidation, to reiterate what I said back then, of small to medium-sized companies into BlackRock portfolio companies. We're getting the pushing of trade over to BRICS. We're getting the isolation of US into a more vassalized state that is controlled by BlackRock's portfolio companies with governments as subordinates. And in order to manage the civil unrest that comes from the wealth inequality, we're getting the surveillance state and the police state that is progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And so Trump did his next initiative. He said, right, we're going to militarize the police in DC. We're going to push out all the criminals. Some cheer, some get scared. And we end up with another beta test of a destabilization campaign, just like we saw in LA. And we'll be covering what happens next week as a result of it. So this is, I think, a good summary of everything that's coming. I'm going to be doing a blog next week breaking down the specific numbers and exactly the impact of the tariff policy so far. But so far, the government has taken in $350 billion, and inflation is going up to producer price index of 3.3%. And the auction is getting ever more desperate to refinance the debt as the government's debt increases to $37 trillion and beyond. And consumers, auto loans, mortgages, they're all going up in value. And we get 401ks, your pension being dumped on, and Bitcoin being the only asset that you can have in order to protect yourself. So what I'd encourage you, if you just watch part 2 this week in macro, please, please, please go back to part 1, because I've given a guide on exactly how to self-custody and protect yourself from these trends and everything you can do to protect yourself. So we're now going to be moving into part 3 of this week in our Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 93, this week in Bitcoin, where we covered basically the Google ban, the China ban, and the Bitcoin strategic reserves and self-custody and how to protect yourself. And we covered in this section the update on the trade policies, the debt, and the inflation figures. And now we're going to be moving over to, by following the money, what's happening in the geopolitical side as well. We use the same methodology. We don't listen to what they say. We follow the money so that we can get ahead and we can start to try and predict, based upon the deals that are being done, what's really happening, so that we can understand that Europe is where the military industrial complex wants to make its profits, because the financial industrial complex wants to make more money out of the Middle East. And therefore, there is a reset of the world order and a blame shift campaign that's happening as we have the destruction and isolation of US and vassalization of Israel. And I'd like to start with a comedy video, which we're going to play in part 3. But just before we play that, if you are not a subscriber on my YouTube channel, we have broken 101,000 subscribers. And we got our silver plate. So thank you to all of you for getting us there. We're trying to get to 210,000 subscribers as the next goal, because 21 is our favorite number with Bitcoin, to eventually get to 1 subscriber for every Bitcoin, 21 million eventually. Hopefully I don't lose my voice before we get there. So please do subscribe if you're not a subscriber already. If you're enjoying this content, I give lots of free resources to make sure you're prepared for this world of Bitcoin, AI, stablecoins, and central bank digital currencies. Also, subscribe and follow me over on Rumble. We're building a little bit of a following there in case we need to switch there, because they're now doing Litecoin, Bitcoin payments, and all sorts of interesting things. And head over to simondixon.com, get a free login to my membership portal, so that you can get all the training and guides to prepare for this world for free. Also, make sure if you use Apple, go to Apple Podcasts, and you can download this and watch the whole 3 hours and 3 parts in a more manageable fashion. You can do the same on Spotify. And if you want to come up and ask me a question, follow me on X, and I go live on Spaces throughout the week to make sure you're up to date with everything that's happening. So that's going to be everything for this week in macro, part 2. And I'm going to take a little bit of a sip of water, and then we'll be jumping straight into this week in geopolitics, part 3, following the money to predict what's coming next and how we need to prepare. Okay, welcome to part 3 this week in geopolitics of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 93, where we went through in previous sections the China ban and the Google ban, and the situation with the US debt in part 2, and inflation. And now we're going to be following the money in order to predict what's happening in the geopolitical stuff. Right. So let's do a little bit of a recap of where we are in case you're new to the show. So I believe that there is a very, very deliberate campaign to essentially turn Israel into a pariah state and isolate America from the rest of the world, as part of what I cover in the macro section. And at the same time, in order to essentially turn Israel into a pariah state, so it can be gobbled up by the regional players, because now the proof of weapons network is more profitable deals to be done with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, like Saudis, like UAE, like the Emirates, like the Kuwaitis, excuse me. The proof of weapons network is getting ready to turn Israel into a toxic asset. Now, that is a slow transition, but right now there is essentially what let's call it Operation Blame Shift, where America is allowing content to go out there to make it look like Israel controls America. And so it's allowing various content and all sorts of stuff to go out there to obfuscate the reality that all of the money ends up back in America to pump up the debt-based Ponzi scheme. Operation Blame Shift is in full effect. Now, Israel is essentially a colony. It doesn't excuse them from the sheer crimes against humanity that they're committing, but they're doing it based upon their relationship with the Proof of Weapons Network. America is a host country. It is vassalized into corporate interests. Governments are subordinate. And the goal with the Federal Reserve debt-based Ponzi scheme is to steal money from the American people through inflation and hand it over to those that have assets in the stock market. And through hyper-financialization and securitization, you have massive wealth inequality that eventually leads to civil unrest. And that civil unrest leads to operations to implement a surveillance and police state. So that's the operation that we're seeing. And so in order to achieve that, you'll notice that what would previously get me banned, where I couldn't even talk about it, I'm now able to talk about it, and there's less censorship, while the algorithms are still not giving me freedom of reach in the messages, but it is giving me an element of freedom of speech that I've never had before. And so I cover more uncensored content on X if you're around there. But essentially, the blame shift operation is there, where these ethical Americans would never do anything, and it's only because they're blackmailed by Israel and Israel controls the world that they're willing to do that in order to obfuscate how the Proof of Weapons Network actually works. And so what I want to do is play you what I think is a comedy video. Let's get a little bit of comedy in there because it's a very serious topic, and sometimes we need to remember, like, these are very serious things. These are serious crimes against humanity. And sometimes I need to distract myself from that reality. But I found a very good video that kind of shows how the change is, the trend is really changing. Like, Israel is a pariah state. Americans are more increasingly at rates that I've never seen, not standing with Israel anymore. And suddenly you're getting all of these large podcasters that are releasing content and interviewing people that previously would never have been allowed, and we were completely censored. They're not quite telling the full truth of how the covert operations, like October the 7th, 9/11, and various other operations were happening, but it's hinting out, and we're getting, this kind of blame shift operation. So Azad, why don't you play the comedy video, and then we're going to go into following the money and look at what Operation Blame Shift leads to, so that we can reinterpret some of the real rage campaigns that are being pushed out there. Azad, let's play the video on how the average American is kind of seeing Israel right now.
Did you guys hear that Trump wants to cut disaster relief funding for people who boycott Israel? Because that's important. Donald Trump, 47th president and first on the Epstein list, put out a statement with FEMA, which is not short for female, I had to look it up, saying that any state that does not stop its residents from boycotting Israel will be denied disaster relief funds. So if you're not cool with families getting bombed, your family deserves a hurricane. And I don't know if you know about the United States, we got a lot of disasters. And they're all of a different vibe, On the west, natural disasters are hot and shaky. On the east, they're wet and twisty, which sounds like a prank you'd play on your friend. I'm gonna give you a wet and twisty, There was a tornado in the Midwest a few weeks ago. Do you see the footage of the aftermath? That place looked like it got hit by Israel. Do you see the fires in LA earlier this year? That place looks like it met Israel. All natural disasters do the exact same damage as Israel, but for way cheaper. I'm just saying, buy domestic. We send all this money to Israel for them to bomb other countries, but why not just invite those other countries to Oklahoma? The only difference between Israel and a tornado is that Congress doesn't keep voting for the tornado. And at some point, the tornado actually stops destroying homes. Now, if you accuse this joke of being anti-Semitic, it's actually the opposite, because I'm saying no one controls the weather. This FEMA statement said that boycotting Israel is anti-Semitic and a form of discrimination, but then it also said any state that participates in DEI will also be punished. It's like, bro, pick a personality. The craziest part is you can boycott American companies and not get punished. You can boycott McDonald's and the government's still going to be like, I'm loving it. But if you boycott Sabra hummus, you're living in a tent, just like you got hit from Israel. Because, America third. because China's like second. And we all know this is happening because Trump has to kiss up to Israel because Israel has the Epstein files. Israel has footage of Trump and Epstein with underage girls, aka FEMAs. Has they connected somehow? They have straight up footage of him caught in 4K, probably 1080p with the technology they had back then. But that's why Trump is so obsessed with the boycott, because that boycott. Our tax money is going to wars and genocides overseas that we don't want. And the government's trying to suppress us from boycotting. It's like, bro, you begging for a revolution? You want it, don't you? Just say it. We'll do it. I'll be your Sam Adams. I'll spill the tea. We got to get a straight up Gen Z revolution, dumping matcha into the lake. I don't think the government's aware. A revolution will f this place up. We'll leave this place looking like it got hit by Israel. And we're going to need some relief for that.
I thought that was absolutely brilliant. It's funny because it's true. I mean, how much that might as well have been an episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk. But now this is really, I think, a reflection of how the unbrainwashed and the realities that people are waking up to. But we need to follow the money because we always go a layer deeper. You know, we're always trying to get ahead of what the traditional narrative is. So now, you know, what Israel really is, and its ability, you know, to be turned into a pariah state is what the current narrative is. Now we need to get ahead of what everyone will now call us a conspiracy theory today, but in a year, if my follow the money analysis is right, everyone will be talking about as if it's obvious, or maybe in a few years. So the reason that I'm saying this is because we are seeing unprecedented events in the Middle East. Now, if America wasn't a fool being pushed into isolationism, and if we hadn't had this tariff policy, I would have thought that the proof of weapons network was up to its old tricks, and they were going to do the forever war model in the Middle East, as they always have, escalating wars, lying to the world, gaslighting the world, and making it look like to the average American that they're exporting democracy. But because that trend is changing, and because America is vassalized, just like UK and Europe, into the proof of weapons network at a scale where the money that they're managing is insignificant compared to the scale of US, and they're in such debt, I interpret the events that are happening in the Middle East as very deliberate, because they could only happen if there was a change in power dynamics. And I think we're witnessing that change in power dynamics. So people think to me, yeah, Simon, you're so ignorant, you don't know the history. I know the history. I know what traditionally the Gulf countries have been. I know the history of, you know, what they've done when they normalized with Israel and stuff. But I'm talking about a changing power dynamics based upon following the money. And so when you're seeing these types of events happening in the Middle East that never would have been allowed to happen before, these are massive, massive shifts underway, which leads me to believe that there is a big negotiation and a big shift that other people aren't quite seeing unless they're following the money. I always talk about the different types of people that I work on these understandings with. I combine it with my stuff, and there's an account that I follow, EvanX, and Middle Nation as well does a lot of work where we're kind of on the same lines, but I add my additional elements as well. So we've hit a little bit of a brain trust to put this stuff together, because sometimes I don't know exactly what's happening in the regions, but I'm able to follow the money and put that together as well, based upon my understanding as well. So anyway, what events are happening? So we saw during the 12-day war, I gave the play-by-play of what was happening as it was all live and all happening. And while everyone was saying, we're going to go to World War III, I said, this isn't World War III. This is agreed. And we got more and more confirmations of that. We got confirmations now this week that Netanyahu was saying these operations were agreed. Trump and the Trump administration said these operations were agreed. Qatar said these operations were agreed. So I was told that I'm evil, a conspiracy theorist, all sorts of stuff Now there's more and more confirmation. But Iran was able to launch missiles against Israel without any kind of full-scale war. That would never have been possible unless the region is resetting and there is coordination amongst regions in order to strategically vassalize Israel and weaken it economically as a toxic asset for strategic acquisition eventually. And so we had France and UK that we covered. They offered to recognize Palestine as a state. That was after the meetings in France with Saudi Arabia and the investments with Qatar in the region and the deals that I covered last time. We saw a refusal from the Gulf Cooperation countries, the GCC, to participate in basically the failed US attempt to stop the Houthis. US effectively lost that war, both under Biden and both under Trump. We covered that in real time. I said it would have to be a ground invasion, but we didn't see any cooperation to try and stop that from the GCC countries. We're now seeing that France has stopped weapons sales to Israel. Even Germany, Germany, the last one, Germany and US are the very last ones you'd expect. But Germany has now stopped engines for tanks that are required. Now, I'm not sure if tanks are needed at this stage, but Germany's the only place you can get them. So, and we also saw from Spain and Portugal that they're stopping any Mediterranean Sea shipments that go towards Israel. And you've also got the Houthis, Ansarallah. They've basically maintained the Red Sea blockade, which is allowed to continue to stop any of the shipments to Israel. Now, there are obviously only the US that is exerting its influence in order to try and stop these things from happening, while the Proof of Weapons Network negotiates with the GCC. So the world is essentially completely capitulating. None of that narrative that we had before, where I unequivocally stand by Israel. The whole world is completely against the sheer disgusting acts that we're seeing by the Proof of Weapons Network, funded by US via its proxy Israel, enabled by the European nations, which is a colonial project to plonk Israel on top of Palestine and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, all because Egypt and Jordan were working with the GCC. Iran and Saudi Arabia normalized with by working with China, and they were able to put a combined resistance against the plan, and therefore they never ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, while there's a continual narrative that they're about to do it, they're about to annihilate. And crimes against humanity are the negotiation tactic of the Proof of Weapons Network. Believe me, the military-industrial complex does not give a damn about the things that we are witnessing that are absolute crimes against humanity. They'll change weapons to fit children. They've been genociding and ethnically cleansing. That's like their normal operation. This has always been happening by these military companies. The world is essentially capitulating from basically the Holocaust that is happening right now. And we're starting to see more and more people like that were involved in Gaza Humanitarian Foundation do whistleblowing. We also saw the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, the Norwegian $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund that is basically boycotting Israel. And the asset managers have divested from 11 different companies until the Gaza genocide ends. They've basically 11 companies, and they said that there's more because they're looking layers and layers deeper as well into the companies that support it. They're making basically, the reason they're doing this is actually Norway with Oslo Accords and various operations. They've always been on the right side for a long time. Why? Because any country that has sovereign wealth is enabled them to have a degree of autonomy where they don't have to bow down to the Proof of Weapons Network. Now, they don't have full autonomy, but their sovereign wealth has allowed them to fight back, and therefore you get normal humanitarian governments that are able to fight back against it. But the point is, all of these capitulations are happening because it's no longer profitable to work with Israel. It's more profitable to be anti-Zionist. And so therefore, the more these narratives are pushed, the more and more you're going to see boycotting, the more and more divestments, and you're going to see more and more sanctions as well in order to turn Israel into a pariah state and a toxic asset. It's only the US left, which is increasingly isolated because it's still putting its hand up at United Nations resolutions and basically enabling this genocide and Holocaust to happen. And I believe it's meant to be connected to US so that America's isolated and Israel is blame shifted, even though, yes, they did it, but all the profits went back to the proof of weapons network. And Israel is meant to be a pariah state that slowly gets acquired as a distressed asset. And we're starting to see more and more of that. So the US is basically now exporting its bombs via its NATO base in Germany. And it's got an air base there. And Germany obviously had to put someone like Merz in. They had to make sure that the different types of political movements don't get in power, so that it continued to be used for America as well. So Israel's economy is becoming more and more dependent upon US, which it always was, because it's a welfare state, which is why you're getting so much anger as Americans realize we got our own problems, and yet you're still allowing Israel to be a welfare state funded by our billions. Now, what they don't want to tell you, they won't tell you that, oh yeah, the money comes back to us, to US companies, and we make trillions from those billions, but we steal it from you and you pay the inflation from our debt-based Ponzi scheme. Instead, they need to say it was because they blackmailed us, and so this is what I think we're seeing right now. So US and Israel are basically going through destabilization campaigns in order to be vassalized further and further into what is being negotiated. And so America is being vassalized further through tariff policies, as I covered in the macro section, into the proof of weapons network. And I believe Israel is being split between the GCC and the CEO of the proof of weapons network, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the portfolio companies that are going to be doing all of the rebuild and are profiting from the war at the moment. So what type of destabilization campaigns have we seen? So we saw that the Israeli government is now voting, basically voted so that the Attorney General can prosecute Prime Minister Netanyahu for his corruption. Now, remember, prior to October the 7th, that's what created there was riots and protests in the streets as a result of that. So they're trying to bring back, and we're seeing more and more protests, more and more destabilization. This is basically that caused the civil unrest prior to October the 7th. And if you haven't seen it, by the way, go to simondixon.com, go to my blog, type in atrocity, and it goes through all of the lies on October the 7th with all of the sources to where all the lies came from and how it perpetuated across the media with exact references. Make sure you watch that documentary, because without truth, there can be no peace. And you have to recognize these operations because they're being done on you right now, and they're being done on us. And we need to recognize them for what they are. So Trump has now declared that US states and cities, quote, that boycott Israeli companies will be denied federal aid for natural disaster preparations. So that was the bit that was covered in the comedy. So right now, literally, if there's a natural disaster in America and you boycott Israel when you can boycott US, that state is not entitled to those relief for Americans. This is pure gaslighting in order to enrage. And we're seeing more and more gaslighting. And obviously, it's being framed as well with the Epstein files. We'll cover the update there. But this is full-scale destabilization campaign. I can't help but think that this is like a cartoon to gaslight people because the sheer gaslighting is just unbearable. And that is causing more and more rage, more and more anger within America. And Trump also gives Israel the green light for the full military occupation of Gaza. And so we also saw that a senior figure within Netanyahu's office has confirmed that Israel has decided to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. Quote, we're going to occupy the Strip. The decision has been made. Hamas won't release more hostages. Netanyahu doesn't want the hostages returned without total surrender. And we won't surrender. If we don't act now, and by the way, Hamas has already said they're not going to be a part of the leadership. I'll go through that when we follow the money. The hostages will be, if we don't do that, the hostages will starve and Hamas will stay in control. So we have to do it right now. For the very first time in history, Netanyahu mentioned the Greater Israel Project. Now, remember, whenever I mentioned that, I was told I'm a conspiracy theorist. It's not there. Now, the Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that he's reconnecting with his spiritual belief and the belief that the Greater Israel Project was a command for God, and therefore he needs parts of Egypt, parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Lebanon, parts of Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza, and parts of Syria, with no border ever drawn, so that it can be exposed for what it actually is. You know, this has always been a settler colonial expansive project. The parliament signed off on more and more settler developments, completely illegal, ruled by the International Criminal Court. They're going to be expanding into the West Bank to just steal land, kill Palestinians. Nothing to do with Gaza, where Hamas rule. This is the Palestinian Authority, which is a puppet government vassalized into the Israeli agenda. And we're starting to see condemnation from all of the different GCC countries as well. We saw interviews that were more very stronger language than we've ever seen. The UAE, which out of everyone in the GCC is the one that is most West aligned. They do the most colonial Western IMF funding militias like they are in Sudan, those types of projects. They're like the most aligned with the West because of their strategies. We're seeing UAE condemn Netanyahu more than we've ever seen. He was talking about, quote, the Greater Israel vision is a blatant breach of international law and the United Nations Charter, joining other Arab leaders, all those in the GCC and extended, in a united rejection of any expansionist plans, threatening regional stability and Arab sovereignty. I always get a comment that someone really wants me to get sovereignty right. So he always puts a comment saying I'm sovereignty. I think it's sovereignty. This feels like basically a complete cartoon to me to destabilize Israel, make it look like a pariah state, turn America for backing it into isolationism, and the Proof of Weapons Network benefit from the whole thing, while the Proof of Weapons Network is negotiating with the GCC, and for whatever reason, they're in a battle to try and get the best deal possible. And the US Proof of Weapons Network is using the genocide in order to negotiate, which is disgusting, sick, but that's how it works. This is how it's always worked. This is what the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund do. This is what it's done to the Global South. This is what it's done to the Middle East. This is what it's done to the Asia regions. This is what it's done to Latin America. This is what backs up the dollar in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. This is what we call American exceptionalism. It is genocide. It is murder. It is stealing of resources in order to bring them back and make people think they're defending democracy. And it is theft upon the American people because it's all done with a system of a debt-based Ponzi scheme that is creating record wealth inequality and complete vassalization of America, of UK, and of Europe, as I've always covered. But what I want you to know, following the money, none of this, what you're seeing, none of this operation is about Hamas. Absolutely none of it. It's not about hostages. There is no desire to return hostages. They are pawns in this game. And Israel, more than anyone, doesn't want them because they are pawns to use for the proof of weapons network. It's no longer about Netanyahu saving his career at this stage. I think he's already negotiated his exit, and he represents military interests, and he's fulfilling the operations in order to get more leverage in the negotiations between the US proof of weapons network and the GCC. It's definitely not about Epstein. I don't believe that this is, look, US politicians are willing to engage in pedophilia. They don't need to be blackmailed to do it. Now, if they get caught on video, yeah, there's blackmail there, but hey, financial interest allows them to do it as well. So yes, Epstein was a blackmail operation, but I don't believe that this is about, being blackmailed. This is something that Trump would do anyway, because this is how the uni party works. They are subordinate to the proof of weapon network. This is essentially the financial industrial complex of the US proof of weapons network, the JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, the BlackRock, the State Streets, the Vanguards, the Blackstones, the various other players, the Citibanks, the Bank of Americas, that are all controlled through the asset managers, basically negotiating their rebuild with the technical industrial complex, the Microsofts, the Apples, the Palantirs, the Googles, the defense contractors, the artificial intelligence, the surveillance state, the technology. They are trying to do a deal with the GCC in order to get the military industrial complex, the Lockheed Martins, the General Dynamics, the Raytheons, the Boeings, the Palantirs, to leave the forever war model, the neocon model that backs the dollar, that gives America all these GDP prints. They need to do a deal that makes a lot more than the money they'd make out of war, violence, death, and destruction. And so Trump is essentially the gatekeeper in this negotiations. The end war, the end game is that the military industrial complex agrees to step aside for the US financial industrial complex, a subdivision of the proof of weapons network and the technical industrial complex. And so the pressure to end is being applied by Saudi, that is working with their EU relationships, and Qatar, which has been investing in these different regions. And the more you invest, the more you control. Think the IMF, think the economic hitmen at the GCC using the IMF model, and the proof of weapons network using the same IF model that it used on the global south, on its own people, on Europe, on UK. And basically, Trump won't apply any direct pressure to end the war at this stage, because he's just a puppet for the negotiations of the proof of weapons network. He continues to entertain that if the proof of weapons network can, make the Palestinians extinct, he's okay with it, as long as he gets to build Trump Tower, as long as he gets to get his Harry Kushner fund, the $2 billion that his son set up to rebuild Gaza and put hotels there. He's okay. The deals that he's been doing for World Liberty Financial and his stable coins and his Trump Towers that he wants to build, he's just in it for the money. And that's why they selected him to do that. His tariff policy was there to reset the order and play these games as well. But this is essentially the genocide and the Holocaust and the ethnic cleansing is the leverage of the US proof of weapons network to negotiate against the GCC. This basically tells me that the holdup right now for peace is probably that the behind-the-scenes agreements are basically misguided economic interests right now. I believe that BlackRock and the proof of weapons network want more vassalization than the GCC is willing to give. And so we're getting, announcements of deals. And so they need more vassalization because the financial industrial complex wants to lend more money and the GCC wants to invest that money instead. And so we're seeing more and more deals being done like that. is not just control over Gaza's future that is being negotiated. It's not just access to reconstruction markets, which the different companies that I mentioned in the macro section profit from, which was ruled in the Texas, case that was ruled as well. So it's no longer Simon Dixon's conspiracy theory. It is basically conceding regional influence at this, basically, which could lead to vassalization and the proof of weapons network gaining more control in the future. And that is why we're seeing BlackRock wants to actually build an office in Saudi Arabia. And so we're seeing those projects start as well. Now, you saw that the CEO of Saudi Aramco got a seat on the board of BlackRock. And so to me, these are the concessions that are going back and forth. And we're seeing the genocide continue as a result, I think, as a result of this as well. I think it's getting a bit darker now. Look, here's the equation. The equation is pretty simple to understand this. Everything that happens in the region, in the Levant, in the Arab nations as well, that is essentially forces Israel to normalize with its neighbors, is a movement towards that there will be liberation for Palestine. The trade contracts, any different types of trade contracts, it is better for Gaza because Gaza is going to be liberated. But with each contract, if it involves doing a deal with the proof of weapons network, the neighboring states, and we don't see any normalization between the neighboring states, and we don't get Palestinian statehood while those negotiations are happening, it's good for Gaza, but it means it's bad for the region. And so the region are having to negotiate, giving up some of its power to BlackRock and the oil companies and the other parts of the proof of weapons network and the banks, where they have more power in the Middle East, because when the Middle East is going to rebuild and benefit from it, it needs to make up its military profits in Europe, Asia Pacific, and various other reasons. And so it's better for the proof of weapons network the longer this goes on for. And the more deals that it locks in, it's good for BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. It's good for Gaza, but it's bad for the regional players because they're conceding more power. They want to invest more because it's like the IMF model. The more you invest, the more control, the more leverage you have. So at this stage, although we're still told that Hamas is an Iranian proxy, I believe Iran is no longer funding Hamas. And essentially, an independent Palestinian state in the absence of Hamas is the coordinated effort. And that is coordinated between the Arab states, Iran, the GCC, and Hamas. But they are basically acting in unity to try and get a deal done, which is being done via negotiations via Qatar and various other regions. So basically, arming Hamas while calling for a free Palestine is basically a two-pronged approach. And this shows basically reciprocity towards a deal. And the deal making is happening right now, which is what gives me hope. But it's also you're negotiating with the proof of weapons network terrorists, and they're willing to allow the genocide to continue. So at this stage, I believe Hamas is entirely under GCC control, working with Palestinian liberation, while Iran has stepped back while they're doing their negotiations and wherever those are going to go as well. Hamas is not rogue at this stage. Don't think they're independent. They're working in unison, but essentially the GCC are doing the negotiations, and we're seeing more and more deals announced along those lines. Hamas will be willing to surrender. They don't want to be involved in the governance. This is a deal that will be done to liberate the Palestinians. And it simply means that the GCC will not settle for what the US and the proof of weapons network is currently pushing for. And that's why we're getting this extended negotiation on the table, which is absolutely unbearable in terms of the humanitarian cost as well. So the whole narrative that Hamas is an Iranian proxy at the moment and the resistance side, I think it's all pure narrative at the moment. It's very easy. It's a synergetic strategy. It allows America to have its narrative that is fighting terrorism. It allows Iran to have leverage while it's engaging its negotiation. It allows the GCC to have its narrative. But essentially, the reason that people can't fight, they find this hard to believe, is because I follow the money. I think I'm following the deals. I think this is what's happening. And I triangulate that with others in the region that understand these games and even work for the proof of weapons network that are whistleblowers I speak to in the background as well. So people basically can't comprehend that the US, Iran, Israel, and the GCC could basically all be benefit from the actions that Hamas governing Gaza actually has, because they're brainwashed into narratives and they listen to the media. That's not how we do it in Bitcoin Hard Talk. We always follow the money. And normally in a year's time, we're trying to get ahead of the narrative that people find unbelievable today. So the reality is that all state normalization with Israel are basically contingent upon Palestinian statehood. There is no nation without statehood. Now, if that happens, I'm wrong, and we got this wrong, and I'll be the first one to admit I'm wrong. But the GCC and Saudi has stuck to that position for 25 years. There will not be normalization without Palestinian statehood, and all of the different types of games that are being played right now. And I find it unbearable to call it games. When I put my humanitarian hat and I get connected to what's actually happening, it is unbearable for me. But now I'm putting on my proof of weapons network and following the money hat and just looking at it from the countries and what they're doing right now. Basically, normalization happens when conditions on a trade deal and any kind of agreement are met. So the more trade deals you see, this is how it works in political realm. Like obviously as the human realm, we're boycotting, we're divesting, we're sanctioning. When you're at the highest level, you're negotiating vassalization, acquisition, distressed purchases, dependency. And so if you do a 35-year oil deal where you're purchasing and you build a trade route, you get that country has a dependency to sell its oil. And then when that has a singular trade route, that means that you get to leverage that in your negotiations. And so we saw the announcement, which everyone was outraged by. And obviously, when you're thinking about boycotting, sanctioning, and divesting, then you would be outraged. But there was an announcement of a $35 billion deal with Egypt, which essentially the headline was that Egypt and Israel are doing a $35 billion deal together. And obviously, that was unbearable because the massive starvation campaign is happening right now. But when you look deeper and follow the money, you realize, no, this is not Israel. This is Chevron. And Chevron is a 40% owner. And there is 60% owned by various other companies. And those various other companies are negotiating with other regional players. So when Western governments begin to call for a Palestinian state, that's basically a signal that the proof of weapons network is fully aligned with the GCC and the agenda, their agenda, and that things are moving towards demonstrations of good faith towards a deal. But also you get the narrative that the proof of weapons network gets to make the other leaders look like traitors and, just puppet states, which they were, but they're negotiating freedom with. So it plays into the hand of the proof of weapons network when everyone pushes the narrative, oh, you're a puppet, you're a traitor, even though they're negotiating these types of deals because most people don't follow the money or understand how this works as well. So when I see more deals like this, I try and express to people that this is moving in the right direction, given the reality of a decolonization process. And all the things that are happening right now wouldn't be happening unless there was a movement towards that. And so the continued arms supply to Israel is also a signal that the terms have been favorable for the proof of weapons network. Because if you continue to arm, military get to make more profit, you get more leverage, you get to negotiate with the GCC. And this is how the proof of weapons network negotiates. This is, if you've read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, this is when I first started to understand how these deals started to work and the crimes against humanity that American corporations have committed in vassalizing countries around the world in order to achieve those resources. They learned from the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company and the British Empire, and they created covert wars. And I've given on my blogs many different types of books for people that want to learn from these operations. But cutting arms supply will basically be the absolute last resort to execute the agreement and the final agreement between the Proof of Weapons Network and the GCC, as I see it today. Because that's what the military-industrial complex, that is where their profits come from. They need genocide, they need ethnic cleansing, they need destruction, they need militia groups, they need groups like Hamas, they need groups like ISIS, they need, in fact, they have training grounds for them, funded by USAID, as I've always covered. This is how you gain power over strategic resources. You destroy countries. This is what is happening across Africa at the moment. This is what's happening across the Middle East. This is what created the war in Syria. It's always Western interference and American interference by the Proof of Weapons Network. Now, obviously, there's competing forces with Russia and various other forces as well. And you have regional powers that will do the same as well. This is how the industry works. These militias, you call it terrorism, but it's basically army being rented to achieve an intelligence agency goal. This is what the British Empire invented. And so if the GCC wants the US military industrial complex to step back, they basically need to offer the financial industrial complex much, much higher margins that outperform what the military industrial complex could have made from the forever wars. And so we saw MERS from Germany, which I think is a big sign in the right direction, because Germany will be the last one in Europe. America will be the last one when they get permission from military corporations. And Mars is basically calling for the seizing of arms supply to Israel. That's a major, major incident and a major, major signal that things are moving in the right direction. Now, they still have their NATO base to allow US to use their base as well. But all of the different things we're seeing, we would only be seeing these things because essentially once the deal is done, this is the end of Israel being supported by the military industrial complex. And that's the deal that's being done. There are no ideological players that are at the top of the game. Everyone else lower down, they're being weaponized for their ideology. Like, you know, there are evangelical Zionists in America. They're just being paid, they're puppets, you know, but they have that ideology. But the ones at the top, you know, the ones that are negotiating, the ones that control the majority shareholding in these positions, you know, these are the ones, these are not ideology. And basically Trump is navigating the Proof of Weapons Network demands and the profit demands that they have while trying to manage the fact that the domestic narrative and the global perception of what's happening and the US foreign policy is getting worse and worse and worse, which is again is a Proof of Weapons Network power play because you can vassalize America just like they did UK and Europe. So everybody basically knows that the continued instability of Gaza risks, if it goes too bad, it risks alienating the GCC because you can reach the point of no return. So the complete genocide can't happen because the GCC has investors, and investors have their, you know, what they want to happen here. And the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the genocide is unacceptable at mass scale. And so they're testing those limitations in order to, it's like a deal that's being done, where they keep pushing you. You get to a deal, they push you, they push you, they push you. And that's just classic how it works. But it can't break down because the financial industrial complex, their portfolios, they need to make up for the lost profits. And then you've got everything that's happening in Europe and Asia Pacific to make up for the lost profits as this final deal comes through. Okay. So basically, the holdup in an economic deal is probably Gaza's reconstruction is a massive opportunity. And basically, I believe, this is speculation, that the GCC and the proof of weapon network are kind of debating over terms. And they don't want too much interference from BlackRock because the GCC want to remain as autonomous as they can while they're negotiating this decolonization. And I think the proof of weapons network is pushing for deals that favor its own firms engaging in the reconstruction. I think GCC want the reconstruction to be done by them, to be done by Egyptians, to be done by their own, firms. And I think BlackRock and the proof of weapons network are trying to get as much done for them. They're trying to impose as many debt structures as they can because that's the network. And they want to get as much control over Gaza's governance as well, because the GCC wants to have decolonization. That's what this deal is about. And obviously, the GCC want to avoid vassalization by BlackRock and the proof of weapons network. We've seen that there were announcements that BlackRock's building their new office in Saudi Arabia. We saw just this week that BlackRock lands an $11 billion natural gas deal with Saudi Arabia. And we saw that Israel is now basically a pressure valve of the proof of weapons network that it can apply on the GCC every time it needs conceding in any of these deals. And so what we started to see is a ratcheting up of the narrative. Netanyahu put out his declaration, basically his declaration to fully take on Gaza. I see that as BS. If we get any escalations, I think it will move towards a negotiation or as part of agreed strategy, as part of the strategic weakening. The deal is basically still on the table as far as I see it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing any of these announcements, and we would be seeing more aggressive. I can't believe I'm even saying it because it's absolutely unbearable. This is the 2025 Holocaust, no doubt. But the best scenario is essentially that the proof of weapons network and the GCC reach a compromise, and basically the contracts are split, and it's across both sides. I don't know what the level of power is, what it's like at the moment. Then Israel will agree to basically scale back its exchange, its operations with the GCC normalization deals. But remember, there will be no deal unless Palestine is a state is achieved. The absolute worst case scenario that can kind of come from this is that the proof of weapons network demands and control over reconstruction and ownership means that they could revassalize, return to a forever war, breach the agreement. So they have to have some kind of even game theoretical scenario where no one breaches the agreement. And basically the GCC pushes for parity and worse terms, and then Gaza suffers more as a result. And this is the demonic game that's being played at the moment. And so that's what I believe we're currently happening. There's a couple of wild cards. There's the cabinet could be overthrown, and there's further aggression. Those are the two different types of wild cards. And we'll keep watching. We'll keep covering. As disgusting as it is, this is the deal. This is how it works. This is how the proof of weapons network works. And we saw an announcement of a deal, as I said, between Israel. So I'll go a little bit into the deal and then we'll wrap up as the final section. Basically, this is the largest gas deal that Israel has ever announced. It was being negotiated before October the 7th. This was a long-term negotiation. What's the name of the company? Leviathan Partners. Basically, they announced a $35 billion export deal with Egypt. This basically will almost triple the annual amount of natural gas supplied to Egypt that currently supplies natural gas at the moment. And it commits Israel to having that route with Egypt, expanding that route. Obviously, that looks awful from optics, so that helps the proof of weapons network gain leverage over Egypt. Egypt has been vassalized by the IMF, but they didn't agree to the ethnic cleansing because they're partnering with the GCC. The deal was organized by a company called NewMed, and they were basically core to the deal. If you look up NewMed, they're organizing the deal, and 40% of the company that's doing it is Chevron, which is a US public company. So this is how the US proof of weapons network benefit as well. If you look at behind NewMed in 2023, BP, British Petroleum, and UAE's ADNOC, they basically moved to acquire 50% of NewMed. And this was paused because of what happened on October the 7th. And so I expect that this deal is back on the table. The UAE will end up with 50% of that deal. And this basically means that you get a movement towards the vassalization of Israel towards working with its neighbors via Egypt and UAE. So what I'm looking for is that if the deal between UAE comes back on the table, then I think this is the right type of thinking and that we're moving towards terms that mean that we're moving in the right direction. Look out for basically more deals from US proof of weapon network on US stock market. And as those more deals happen, you know that they're eventually going to get to the point where I think they agree to end this genocide without pushing the deal too far. And that's the sick thing of how this works. Already said that BlackRock, they announced an $11 billion natural gas deal with Saudi Arabia. This can basically open up the options for Egypt so that they could do a future pivot away from Israel, depending on how vassalization goes. So if you've got Israel creating a dependency upon Egypt for the largest deal they've ever done, and then BlackRock is doing a deal in order to you can basically open up new corridors between Egypt as a result. And then this could lead to a pivot of that deal and some other type of negotiations. Egypt can initially keep the Israeli supply, but it can be short term while it basically avoids any type of shortages. And by the way, there are massive shortages as a result of this. So Egypt needs to resolve this issue. Otherwise, there'll be power shortages and all sorts of stuff in Egypt. So it's a horrible situation that they've been vassalized into. It's how it works. But then they can continue some of those imports. They can build up type of refinery, or they can liquefy the natural gas within Egypt, which can build an industry. And then they can export that LNG as a result of this type of deal and the excess capacity. That's probably the plan. We'll see. But Saudi and Gulf sovereign funds could basically be used to buy out the deal. And then they can do it as Israel gets more distressed. And then they get a better type of price. And these are the types of negotiations that I think are being done. They could do a hostile takeover of Egypt's obligations, and then they can change some of the terms, change some of the supply as this moves forward later as well. Okay. A couple more stories, then we'll end up. These are more shorter as well. On the US side, the Proof of Weapons Network, they continue to weaponize the Epstein files. And I think this is about getting more strategic leverage over Trump, over Epstein. Sorry, not Epstein, over various other players. Over, this is controlled by the banksters. Lex Wexner, all of the other financial players that have been revealed so far that we can see based upon the court documents and the settlements and various other things. But clearly there's some leverage there as well. There was a court drop. So the NYT dropped that basically Epstein's mansion photos. So they revealed a bunch of photos and documents that were in the Epstein mansions. Now, it's very interesting the timing of this with these negotiations as well. So there was an image of Jeffrey Epstein wearing an Israeli IDF shirt on a plane. And this was obtained by the Telegraph. So you start to see that this is a part of Operation Blame Shift, I'd say, that this is being released. The photos also included that there was a picture of Jeffrey Epstein with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, MBS, and ZBS of UAE. So I think this is about gaining more leverage as well in these negotiations. That's very convenient timing, I think, as well. And we saw that Ghislaine Maxwell has now been cleared, essentially clearing Trump's name. This is a private meeting that happened between the Trump administration and Ghislaine Maxwell. And basically the report was that he never did anything concerning... Ghislaine Maxwell is saying that Trump never did anything concerning around her, is a statement that was reported by ABC News. We know that the media is controlled by the Proof of Weapons Network. This gives them strategic leverage. Trump is doing everything they want, but it means that he gets, to be, make sure that he's always doing what the Proof of Weapons Network wants as well. Her lawyer said afterwards that Ghislaine Maxwell would welcome any relief. And so you may get a sick, disgusting presidential pardon. But she was already moved to a prison, which apparently is minimum security. Remember, Jeffrey Epstein he was imprisoned. He was allowed to go out and do business. There's prisons for those that you strategically have to give them prison sentence, but instead they get to do their calls, they get to do their business. And apparently so she's moved now to somewhere more favorable, and she gets to negotiate whether she gets to do a pardon. And of course, if she gets a pardon, there will be no testimony that Trump did everything. So strategic leverage for the Proof of Weapons Network for Mossad operatives in order to make sure that those in government that are subordinate to them do what they say. And guess what? You don't need to blackmail them because these people, they tend to be willing to do these things. And sometimes they're coerced, whatever that may be. The truth will maybe eventually come out, or they'll maybe continue to be weaponized and used. So Trump may pardon her. This will essentially enrage US MAGA and give the Proof of Weapons Network more leverage. That's the idea, I think, of what we're seeing just by following the money. Meanwhile, Trump is meeting Putin today. Maybe during this time, we've seen some outcomes. They're meeting in Alaska right now. I'll give some more details on that next week. There was a big escalation, or at least the perception of an escalation between America wanting to sell more weapons via the Proof of Weapons Network to Zelensky, another member of the Proof of Weapons Network, is my speculation. And there were lots of tough words between Putin and Trump. Basically, Trump says, we're totally prepared for nuclear war with Russia. And Trump's order was basically granted in order to move some nuclear submarines over as well. So there's lots of strong language that led towards this meeting. And basically, the two largest nuclear superpowers in the world are flexing leading up to this meeting and doing it publicly. In response, China, Russia, they started doing some coordinated joint naval drills. And that was around the Sea of Japan, where the military-industrial complex wants to make lots of profits from, if they exit the Middle East, they want to do Asia Pacific and Europe as where they make most of their profits. I think it will be mainly fear defense contracts. Americans will pay the bill. Europe will pay the bill for all the profits that will be made from escalating the war in Europe. And personally, my belief, my forecast from following the money is that I cannot imagine any peace deal coming from this. You may get some talks, you may get some flip-flops, but the cold, hard reality when you follow the money is there is a bunch of euros to be printed, there is a bunch of pounds to be printed, because all of the puppet governments across Europe and UK are willing to hand over all that money so that it ends up in US bank accounts, and the corrupt politicians, they get to take their cut. And Zelensky doesn't want to end the war because he gets his cut. And that's what I see happening. And I think there's a lot more money to be made. But anyway, I was leaving off on there is a meeting with Putin and Trump today. I don't expect peace to happen. There's too many pounds, too many euros to be made, too much corruption, and it will all end up in US bank accounts for the proof of weapons network, as well as cuts to Germany, France, UK, and all the so-called defending democracy people that are puppets for the proof of weapons network as well, that are all compromised, which is why you always see these bad leaders as well. They need to make up for the profits because I believe that eventually the genocide will end, and they need to go to the Asia Pacific region in defense side and escalation in Europe. And so that's going to be everything for this week in geopolitics. We had 2 weeks to cover, so there was a lot to cover. If you want to break this up and watch it in 3 parts and you're just watching the 3rd part now, feel free to go back to part 1, part 2. Remember to subscribe to me on YouTube. Remember to follow me on Rumble, where I'm probably, if they start integrating with Bitcoin, going to start working on interesting things around there. Remember to get your guide to self-custody. If you didn't watch part 1 on This Week in Bitcoin, or you can head over to my blog, simondixon.com, put in custody there. We're giving a guide to people of how they can boycott the proof of weapons network with peaceful proof of work, all the technical details so that you can exit the system and get more sovereign. Make sure you get a login to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Is completely free. Download the Bitcoin Hard Talk podcast on Spotify. Download it on what else? Apple Podcasts. And leave a comment below. I do answer these questions. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to do incredibly well. Those opt out with self-custody. Others are going to be absolutely wrecked. And you can see that from where these operations are going right now. I want to make sure you're on the right side of the change and you understand what a world of Bitcoin, AI, central bank digital currency, and stable coins look like. I'd like us to do it with peace, love, unity. And that's why I want to make sure that you're more prepared. That's everything that I've got for you in Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 93, where we did 2 weeks in Bitcoin, 2 weeks in macro, 2 weeks in geopolitics. The main topic was Google and China banning Bitcoin, and we covered all of the flip-flopping when it was unbanned, banned, and everything that happened with the Bitcoin strategic reserves as well. So I will see you this time next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 94. Peace.